Arya Stark stood over the Hound's broken form, the sound of Brienne's horse fading in the distance. The air was still charged with tension from the epic struggle that had just taken place. Blood pooled beneath the Hound, or Sandor Clegane, as the man's real name was. He had told it to Arya once, though she cared little for noble names. The bite of autumn's chill rolled through the valley, rustling the sparse grasses and carrying the scent of rotting leaves. She should leave him, she ought to leave him. Everything in her told her that if she wanted to keep going alone, this was the moment to slip away. He had been defeated, his leg was shredded, he was half-conscious, and his voice, when it came at all, was little more than a ragged plea. She heard him ask her to give him the gift of mercy. He demanded she stab him in the heart, to let him die. The river raged far below them, and gulls screamed overhead as though mocking his torment. An emotion clenched in her chest, something like triumph or satisfaction. She remembered all the reasons she had once hated him, but memory is slippery, and hate blurs when it meets pity. She knelt beside him. Her fingers grazed the hilt of needle, but her eyes focused on his battered face. The left side was bruised purple and black, and dried blood streaked his lips. She could see the deep cut on his neck, the ragged slash near his collarbone, and most grievous of all, the wound in his leg, the one that would surely kill him slowly if she left him here. He continued to taunt her, through clenched teeth, demanding she end it. "Go on, girl," he said, though his voice cracked. "Kill me and be done with it. That's what you want, isn't it? I'm nothing but a name on your list." Her list had always been a whisper in the back of her mind. So many names had blurred. She had wanted to kill the Hound once, but now, watching him struggle to breathe, she felt less anger than she expected. She remembered how he had saved her from the Brotherhood without banners, though that rescue had been its own kidnapping. She remembered how he had tried to protect her, even if only for the promise of ransom. And she remembered him fending off those who might harm her. The world was not a place of simple good and evil. She was learning. She stood, looking down at him in silence, anger and pity warring within her. The living vow in her heart grew muddied. She recalled his cruelty, yes, but also the rare flickers of something else. With a short exhalation, she crouched again, gripping Needle's hilt. He coughed. "You think you're too good for it, girl? You've killed before. I've seen it. Just do me in." His words were more resigned than furious, but she could hear the grit of frustration there. No man wants to die begging in the dirt. She studied his eyes. He didn't look away. The Hound had never been one for hiding, at least not in that sense. Arya listened to the wind rustle through the gnarled branches overhead. All around them lay stones and scrubby bushes with faint autumn blooms. She recalled Yoren's words to her about sticking them with the pointy end, and she remembered every lesson the Hound's presence had taught her. Finally, she said nothing. She simply removed a scrap of cloth from her small pack. With surprising gentleness, she touched it to his wounds. He flinched, but there was no outraged curse. There was only the sound of his ragged breathing, the raspy pull of blood in his lungs, and the faintest beginnings of disbelief in his eyes. "I'm not killing you," she muttered. "Not today." She did not try to explain herself. There were no words that could properly capture the swirl in her heart. One moment, she wanted to slip Needle between his ribs, to avenge all the stark deaths and cruelties that he symbolized. The next, she couldn't help but remember him as her grudging protector. All she knew was that leaving him to rot felt wrong in this moment. She'd parted ways with everyone in her life far too soon. Her father, her mother, Rob. Everyone was gone. Maybe it was foolish sentiment, but she couldn't bring herself to walk away from yet another figure who had loomed so large in her life these past moons. He grunted as she inspected his wounds. The slash in his thigh bled heavily. She pressed down with the cloth. The Hound cursed, biting down on the pain, but she saw in his expression a glint of something other than fury. Gratitude, perhaps. She wasn't sure. After a minute, she spoke. "We'll need a place to bind you up properly. You can't walk. I can't carry you." She paused, flicking her eyes around for any sign of travelers. "There might be a village back that way," she added. nodding toward the narrow trail from which they'd come. "But if we try to go forward, maybe we'll reach the Vale. The Eyrie is near." She couldn't resist a bitter snort. "Though Aunt Lisa's dead. No ransom left there." He gave a low, sputtering laugh, followed by a cough that speckled red into the dirt. "Then we go where we can find a bloody maester," he said, gasping. "Or we find somewhere with bandages, strong drink, anything to keep my leg from rotting off. If you plan to keep me alive, girl, do it right." They spent the next hour in mostly silence. Arya scavenged for a makeshift crutch, cutting down a sturdy branch that the Hound could use to limp. He cursed and spat as she tried to lift him, but he fought to stay on his feet, putting most of his weight on his good leg. They advanced in short, laborious steps back along the same route from which they'd come. Every so often, he hissed between his teeth, and Arya would stop to let him catch his breath. The day stretched on, the sun sinking behind the ridges until they found a deserted shepherd's hut. The structure was half collapsed, but it offered enough shelter from the wind, and a small stream nearby provided clean water. They settled in. Arya gathered what bits of dried grass and wood she could find, building a small fire. She watched him lower himself onto a patch of rags. His face contorted in pain as he finally gave in to rest. They remained there in that lonely hut for 3 days. Arya used what meager supplies she had, some stolen salves, some rags, to keep his wounds from festering. She remembered bits and pieces of what she had learned from her mother's attendants at Winterfell and from the men of the Night's Watch who had once passed through. She was no maester, but the Hound was a hardy man, and though fever set upon him the second night, he managed to fight it off. She watched him twist and mutter in his fever dream, words about fire, about his brother Gregor, about some memory of searing terror. She stayed awake through the night, sponging his brow with cool water and listening to him murmur her name, sometimes with anger, sometimes with something else. By the 4th dawn, his fever had receded somewhat, and he was able to sit and look at her with sunken eyes. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his tone rasping but holding a quiet curiosity that disarmed her. "You had every reason to leave me, or kill me," she shrugged, pulling her threadbare cloak tighter around her shoulders. She hadn't quite sorted out an answer for that herself. "I don't know," she said truthfully. "Maybe because I'm tired of watching everyone around me die." He scoffed, but it wasn't entirely unkind. "You're a fool," he muttered. Then he closed his eyes, letting out a painful sigh. "But maybe a bigger fool would have run off and gotten herself killed by now. The roads aren't safe, not for a girl alone." She stiffened. "I'm not a girl," she said hotly. "I'm a wolf." He barked a weak laugh that turned into a groan. He whispered, "a wolf with a toothpick for a sword." Though she should have been annoyed, something about his comment reminded her of the banter they'd shared. Once, she'd threatened to put needle through his eye. He'd always volleyed back with a remark that was half scorn, half reluctant respect. She might not have recognized it then, but she could see it more clearly now. They spent another 2 days gathering their strength. Arya hunted squirrels and rabbits, though the game in that area was sparse. She skinned them clumsily, cooking them over a feeble fire. The Hound ate with the brutal efficiency of a starving animal, but she could see that his appetite was returning, which she took as a good sign. He refused to rely on her entirely, even insisting on hobbling outside to fetch water from the stream, though the process left him white-faced with pain. On the 5th day, he gripped his improvised crutch and said, "We've been here too long. Sooner or later, someone will wander by. We need to move." Arya agreed. She gathered her few belongings, which fit into a small pack. Needle was always by her side. The Hound's sword weighed heavily in his hand as he tested it, but after a few swings, he sheathed it, satisfied that he could still wield it if needed. They set out in the pale morning light, the hush of the wilderness broken only by their footsteps. Sandor's limp was pronounced, and his breathing labored, but neither spoke of stopping. They pressed on, forging a path that eventually brought them back to the main road. A deserted track wound between rolling hills and patches of forest, heading roughly east, toward the Vale. The hours turned into days as they trudged on. Their pace was slow. More than once, Arya caught the Hound nearly toppling from pain or exhaustion. She steeled herself and helped him along. His pride still growled at the notion of being aided by a young girl, but something had shifted between them. Neither apologized nor spoke of it openly, but they worked as a unit, an unspoken pact binding them. They'd share water, share watch duties when they camped, share whatever meager loot they found in the ruins of houses or from the rare traveler who dared pass them. Their first encounter on the road came on a crisp morning when the sun was just rising. A pair of riders approached from the opposite direction. They were men in dingy leather, sporting swords at their belts, the look of sellswords or perhaps outlaws. Their mounts were tired, thin, and the men eyed Arya and Sandor suspiciously. The Hound stood tall, ignoring the pain in his leg, letting the travelers see the broad strength of his shoulders and the hilt of his famous sword. One of the men frowned, seeming to recognize him. Perhaps news of the Hound's deeds and his battered condition had spread. Arya felt the tension in the air. She was ready to pull needle in a heartbeat. The lead outlaw sneered. "Heard the Hound was dead," he remarked. His hand hovered near his weapon. "Guess the stories were wrong. You got a bounty on your head, though, don't you?" His eyes flicked to Arya. "And you, girl, traveling with a monster? Or is he dragging you along?" Arya felt the old reflexive anger stir. She looked at the Hound. She could sense him coiled, like a wounded wolf ready to snap. Slowly, she stepped forward. "He's not dragging me anywhere, and we have nothing for you, so move on," she said, her voice calm but menacing in its youth. She'd discovered that sometimes the bold approach worked best. The more vicious she acted, the more men thought twice about tangling with her. The second outlaw spat in the dirt. "I say we take the girl's sword. See if they got anything worth silver." He flicked his gaze between them. The bounty on the Hound could be enough to buy a small keep. Arya's heart hammered, but she kept her face cold as steel. The next moment was a blur. The Hound, ignoring the pain in his leg, roared and lunged forward. The first man fumbled for his blade, but Sandor's sword found its mark, cleaving through the man's chest. Blood sprayed across the dusty road. The second man flinched, but Arya was already darting in. Needle flashed, slipping under the gap in the man's armor, piercing his side. He howled, dropping his sword, and stumbled back, blood seeping between his fingers. Before he could recover, Sandor twisted around and slammed his pommel into the side of the man's head. He went down hard. For a moment, only ragged breathing filled the air. The Hound grimaced from the strain on his injured leg, but he kept his sword raised. Arya watched, half stunned, half exhilarated. The man on the ground was still alive, clutching his wound. He looked up at them with terrified eyes. She saw him open his mouth to beg. The Hound spared him no mercy, crushing his skull with a single brutal blow. Arya swallowed, not sure whether to feel revulsion or acceptance. This was the life they led. This was the world. Those men would have killed them or dragged them to be sold for bounty. She took a steadying breath. They looted what little the men carried. Some stale bread, a few coins, and, most importantly, the pair of horses. Neither beast was in good shape, but they were better than walking. Arya helped the Hound onto one horse, and she mounted the other. They rode away from the gory scene. Neither spoke for the next hour, letting the wind whistle around them. It was the first moment they truly moved faster than a limp since his injury. Despite the violence, having horses felt like a stroke of fortune. But fortune in Westeros often carried a dark edge. That night, they camped in a small grove near a tributary. The horses grazed on the sparse grass while Arya and the Hound built a small fire for warmth. Arya tried not to stare at the Hound's leg, but she noticed he was favoring it more, the day's fighting having torn open his stitches. She forced him to let her examine it. For once, he did not protest too loudly. She pressed a fresh scrap of cloth against the wound, cleaning it with water from the stream. He hissed in pain. "You're going to get an infection," she muttered, frowning at the raw edges. "We need a maester, or at least a proper remedy." He grunted. "We'll find one," he said, "or I'll just hobble around and kill anyone who tries to take my head until I keel over." He let out a half laugh, half groan. "A fine life that'll be, eh?" Arya shook her head, focusing on the bandage. "We'll get you to the Vale. They must have some smaller holdfast, maybe a settlement that has supplies and a half-trained maester." "Think they'll just welcome the Hound in with open arms?" he asked, his lip curling. But there was a trace of sardonic humor in his voice. She met his gaze. "You've seen me lie well enough. We'll find a way." Then she paused, looking at him more seriously. "You saved me from them, those men on the road. You didn't have to. You could have just let me handle it." He snorted. "They were bigger than you, and I can't stand incompetent thieves. Anyway, you handled yourself fine enough." It wasn't exactly a thank you, but neither was it the harsh rebuke she was used to. She nodded and finished tying the bandage. The hush of night settled around them, and for the first time in days, they both looked at each other without the weight of death pressing quite so close. Arya thought about the road ahead. She wondered if her sister Sansa was still in the Vale somewhere. She wondered if she had family left at all. The only certainty was that tomorrow they'd continue traveling together. They rose before dawn, saddling the horses. The sunrise cast pale pink light through the naked branches. The path to the Vale was uncertain. Word was that Lisa Arryn was dead, that Littlefinger held the power behind the gates of the Eyrie. Arya had little desire to meet him again, and the Hound had no illusions about receiving a warm welcome, especially if the Lords of the Vale remembered his role in the War of the Five Kings. Still, the region was large, filled with small villages and homesteads where one might find a bandage or a bottle of milk of the poppy. They pressed on, pushing the horses at a moderate pace. Every mile felt a little easier on the Hound's leg, or perhaps he was simply growing used to the pain. On the third day since they'd claimed the horses, they reached the foothills that led up to the Bloody Gate, the main passage into the Vale. Stark gray cliffs loomed overhead, dotted with tufts of hardy shrubs. The road grew narrow and treacherous, winding along precarious ledges. If they continued, they'd inevitably face the gate. The Hound glanced at Arya. "If we go that way, we'll run straight into the Knight of the Gate or whoever holds it now. And if they recognize me or you..." He left the threat unspoken. Arya nodded. She remembered too well the last time she'd been here, the disappointment of Lisa's death just moments before they arrived. She also knew that Sansa was rumored to be living under Littlefinger's guardianship. Or at least she had been. There was no telling if she still remained behind those high walls. "We don't have to go through the Bloody Gate," Arya said. "There are smaller paths, shepherd's trails. Maybe we can find a hidden way in." Sandor snorted. Let's hope we don't break our necks. My leg's feeling just fine now. A tumble down the cliffs would be a nice way to end it." She smirked slightly. "You'd bounce, maybe." They guided their horses off the main road, searching for a smaller trail that wound around the valley. Eventually, they found a narrow path that looked as though it was used by goats or local shepherds. They followed it for hours, carefully navigating the rocky switchbacks. The crisp mountain air bit at Arya's nose. She kept an eye on the ground for signs of water or smoke. At midday, they spotted a distant wisp of smoke curling above a ridge. They continued until they came upon a small farm, a cluster of weather-beaten huts and a pen holding a few scrawny goats. An older woman emerged, hobbling on a twisted ankle, suspicion etched into her wrinkled face. She eyed the Hound's scars, then Arya's sword. "What do you want?" she demanded in a quavering voice. Arya raised her hands in what she hoped was a non-threatening gesture. "We're looking for some supplies," she said. "A bit of bandaging, maybe a poultice for an infected wound. We can pay." She reached into her pouch, extracting a couple of silver coins they'd taken from the outlaws. The old woman's eyes flicked to the metal, shining greedily. She disappeared into her hut, returning after a moment with a small clay jar, a stack of fraying bandages, and a pungent herb that Arya recognized from Winterfell's kitchens as something that could be crushed into a disinfectant paste. The woman snatched the coins from Arya's hand. "That's all I have," she said, not offering them any courtesy beyond that. Try not to bother me again." Arya nodded, and they started to turn away, but the Hound cleared his throat. "One more thing," he said, his voice gruff. He reached into his pocket and produced a small coin of copper. "Got any ale or wine? Or something for the pain?" The woman grimaced, her eyes flicking to the battered sword at the Hound's side, then shrugged, heading back into the hut. Moments later, she returned with a small skin of what smelled like strong wine, stale but drinkable. She snatched the copper coin from his outstretched hand, and that concluded their business. They rode off without further exchange. At a discreet distance from the farm, they paused by a rocky outcrop to tend his wound more thoroughly. Arya crushed the herb with a flat stone, mixing in a dash of water to form a rudimentary poultice. "This might hurt," she warned him, spreading the pungent mixture across the torn flesh. He hissed, clenching his jaw, but said nothing. Then she wound the fresh bandage around his thigh, tying it off firmly. "That's better," he grunted after a minute, though sweat beaded his brow. He took a swig from the wineskin, grimacing at the taste, then offered it to Arya. She took a small sip, coughing at the bitterness. She wasn't fond of wine, but the warmth in her belly felt oddly comforting in the chilly air. She handed it back, letting him gulp down more as if to dull the steady ache in his leg. They pressed on, continuing their slow climb into the vale. When the sun dipped low, they found a sheltered spot beneath a rocky overhang to camp. Nightfall settled, cloaking them in dark. There was something almost peaceful about the lonely mountains. Arya watched the stars appear overhead, remembering the skies of the north. She thought of her father, how he'd taught her to find the ice dragon among the stars. She didn't speak of such memories to the Hound. They had an unspoken rule to keep their pasts hidden, or at least unspoken. But some nights, she found herself tracing the constellations silently, thinking of what might have been. The next morning, they discovered a worn track that snaked along a ridge. Following it, they glimpsed distant farmland and a village with a palisade fence. The Hound squinted at it. "Might be somewhere to buy proper food," he said, "or to get ourselves killed if they see your direwolf sigil or remember my face." Arya shrugged. She had no illusions about being welcomed anywhere. But they were hungry, and if they wanted to push deeper into the Vale, they needed better supplies. Their plan of lying low in these mountains might require weeks of cautious travel. "We can take the risk," she said. "Keep your hood up. I'll do most of the talking." They rode down toward the village, which proved to be larger than it first appeared. A handful of shacks lined the muddy thoroughfare, and a small marketplace stood near the center. A few townsfolk sold turnips, onions, salted fish. The clamor was subdued, the people's clothes well worn. Arya pulled up the hood of her dark cloak, leading her horse carefully over the uneven ground. The Hound followed, his own cloak concealing much of his face. He kept a hand near the hilt of his sword, wary. Arya approached a stall with a bored-looking man selling dried apples and barley. She tried to mimic a more country accent, batting her eyelashes innocently. "Good morning," she said. "We're travelers, looking for provisions." She slid a copper piece across the rough wood. "We'll take as much barley as that'll buy." She pointed to a small sack. The man grunted, scooping a portion of barley into a cloth bag, then extended it to her. "Heavy times," he muttered. "Not many travelers come this way lately, with rumors of trouble on the roads." He eyed Sandor warily, though the Hound said nothing. "Best to avoid the main roads," Arya replied, trying to sound careless. "More bandits than honest folks these days." The stall-keeper nodded agreement. Then, lowering his voice, he said, "I heard talk that the Hound is roaming these parts, the one who served the Lannisters. Folks say there's a bounty on him. He's a dangerous killer." Arya felt her pulse quicken, but she forced a nonchalant expression. "Is that so?" she said. "I heard he was dead." "Not so dead," the man replied. "He's out there traveling with a girl, they say. But if they come here, we'll see about collecting that reward." His gaze flicked again to the Hound's broad shoulders, but he didn't seem to recognize him. The hood must have shadowed the scars well. Anyway, stay safe on the roads. Arya forced a tight-lipped smile and nodded. She took the barley and moved on quickly, carefully guiding her horse away from the stall. Sandor's posture was rigid with tension. They continued through the narrow lanes, buying a few more supplies. A couple of onions, a pouch of salt, and a bit of salted meat that cost more coins than they liked. But coin was worthless if they starved, and they had no illusions about making an honest living in the Vale. Their business nearly concluded. They were about to leave the village when a trio of local men stepped in front of them, blocking their path. They carried crude spears, the tips sharpened iron. One of them, presumably the leader, wore a makeshift leather jerkin and had greasy brown hair. He looked from Arya to the Hound. "Hold there," he said. "Town levy. We collect a toll from travelers for using our roads." Arya's jaw set. "We've already done our trading," she said. "We paid fair coin for what we bought. We owe no toll." The man's eyes narrowed. "Everyone pays. Don't try to cheat us." He jabbed the butt of his spear into the dirt. "Or we'll throw you in the stocks." Sandor let out a rumbling growl. Arya felt the tension building. She tried to keep her voice level. "We have no interest in trouble," she said. "But if you stand in our way, you'll regret it." The men exchanged looks, uncertain. One pointed at the Hound, squinting. "He's too big to be just any old traveler," he muttered. "He might be the one we've heard about, the Hound." The leader sneered, stepping forward. "If that's true, we'll be the ones collecting the bounty. Let's have a look at your face." He reached out to yank the Hound's hood away. That was all the provocation needed. Sandor seized the man's wrist and twisted, eliciting a shriek of pain. Arya heard bones crack. The other two men lunged, spears raised. She guided her horse aside and drew Needle in one smooth motion, slashing at the nearest spear shaft. The sharpened iron tip wobbled, losing momentum. Meanwhile, the Hound tossed the first man aside like a rag doll, then drew his own sword. A single stroke cut through the second man's torso, spattering the muddy ground with crimson. The third man dropped his spear, trying to flee, but Arya's horse reared, blocking his path. She pressed Needle against his neck, a swirl of adrenaline pulsing through her. His eyes bulged in terror. He stammered, "Mercy! I was only following orders." Sandor advanced, sword dripping blood. The man cowered, but before the Hound could strike, Arya looked at him. "Enough," she said quietly. She looked at the trembling man. "You're the one who threatened us. The levy, was that your idea?" He nodded frantically, tears forming. "We have no coin," he choked. "The lords do nothing to help. We were trying to protect ourselves." Arya wasn't convinced. She saw the fear in his eyes, but also recognized that if they let him go, word would spread. The bounty on the Hound was no secret. She looked at Sandor. She saw the subtle tension in his stance, the unspoken question. Should he kill this man or let him live? Time seemed to slow. Then she pulled Needle away from his neck and gave the horse a gentle nudge, forcing the man to scramble back. He fell into the mud, panting. "Run," she said, her voice hollow. "But if you tell anyone about us, we'll come back, and next time I won't stop him." The man needed no further prompting. He stumbled to his feet, half limping, and sprinted off between the huts. A few villagers had emerged to watch, some peering from windows, others from behind corners. Arya felt their eyes on her. Without a word, she and the Hound spurred their horses, riding quickly out of the village and up the winding road once more. They did not speak for a solid hour, the tension still thick between them. Finally, Sandor broke the silence. "You should have let me kill him," he said, not unkindly, but with a grim practicality. "He'll bring men after us, or word will spread." Arya shrugged, though her heart felt heavy. "I know," she admitted, "but I'm tired of killing. If I can help it, I won't add more names to my list today." She expected him to mock her, to say something about how the world was cruel and she was naive. But he only let out a low grunt and kept riding. The day stretched on, and they reached a high pass overlooking a sweeping valley below. Clouds gathered overhead, threatening rain. Over the coming weeks, the pair continued a pattern of riding by day, avoiding large settlements, and camping in remote corners of the Vale by night. Sandor's leg slowly mended, though it never quite regained the full strength it had before. He'd always walk with a slight limp, but he could ride and fight well enough. They honed their partnership, falling into a lethal rhythm whenever they encountered outlaws or men seeking to claim the Hound's bounty. Arya learned how to read his movements, anticipating when he'd strike, slipping needle into the openings that his brute force created. She became faster, more decisive. The Hound, in turn, taught her more about real battle, the harsh truths of survival on the roads. There were times he saved her from a well-aimed arrow, times she saved him from a spear thrust aimed at his blind side. Word of their exploits, some would call them depredations, began to whisper across the Vale. The monstrous Hound and his deadly young companion, a wolf girl with a thin sword, striking out at travelers who threatened them first, at lords' men who came with the promise of a bounty. Some whispered they were ghosts, unstoppable and full of rage. Others said they were merely desperate outlaws. Arya knew the truth. She didn't relish the killing, but she found she no longer trembled at the sight of blood. A part of her recognized that she was forging a place in this chaotic land. She also felt the Hound's grudging respect, though he never said it aloud. It was in the way he made sure she was always well-fed, or the way he insisted she keep watch while he slept, trusting her vigilance. One night, as the autumn winds grew colder, they sat around a small fire in a shallow cave overlooking a steep ravine. Arya huddled under her cloak, gnawing on stale bread. The Hound took a swig of whatever cheap wine they'd managed to loot. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and she glanced up at the sky. "We should build a better shelter," she said. "This storm might be a bad one." He shrugged. "We'll stay dry enough here, if it doesn't blow in sideways." He frowned at her, the firelight casting dancing shadows across his scarred face. "You're not frightened of storms, are you? I know you're not frightened of men." She bristled slightly. "No, I'm not frightened of storms," she muttered. She fiddled with a pebble near her feet. After a moment, she looked at him, curiosity stirring. "Why did you hate your brother so much? Was it just the fire? Or was it everything else?" She didn't know why she asked. Perhaps it was the mood of the night, the sense that they were two exiles huddled against the world, with nothing but each other for conversation. He scowled, the usual reaction whenever Gregor was mentioned. But maybe the wine had loosened his tongue, or maybe the countless nights traveling had eroded some of his defenses. He let out a slow breath. "Because he's a monster," he said simply. "Because he burned my face when I was a boy, and my father protected him, lied about it. Because he killed and raped and pillaged in the name of the Lannisters, and they gave him a castle for it. Because all my life I've had to be the dog on a leash, while he got to be the rabid wolf. That's all." Arya nodded. In truth, she understood a bit about hating someone for hurting you so profoundly. The list of names she carried in her mind often swirled around that same sort of rage. "I suppose we both have older siblings who've made our lives miserable," she said, thinking of Sansa and how she'd once believed her sister's naivety had cost their father his life. That old resentment had softened over time, replaced by longing to see her sister again, but the memory lingered. The Hound let out a gruff laugh. "Sansa wasn't so bad," he said. "She was a stupid bird in a cage, but not cruel. She might still be alive in the Eyrie, for all we know." Arya looked at him sharply. "What do you mean?" He shrugged, avoiding her eyes. "When we were at the Twins, I remember seeing her in King's Landing, caged up by the Lannisters. You told me yourself that your Aunt Lisa had her, or that's what we heard. Seems a fragile creature to survive. But who knows? Maybe she found a way." Arya took a slow breath, letting the faint flicker of hope settle in her chest. She didn't know why she suddenly felt a surge of protectiveness for Sansa. Their relationship had been complicated. And yet, if Sansa was still out there, still alive, that meant some part of her family remained. "If she's alive, I want to find her," Arya said quietly. She's still my sister." Sandor studied her, expression unreadable. Then he shifted, leaning back against the stone wall of the cave. "You'd risk going to the Eyrie for that? Even with all the knights and lords who might be after us?" She hesitated, scanning the dancing firelight. "Maybe," she answered, "but not yet. Not until we're ready." She glanced at him. "And I'd need your help. You know how to fight knights. You fought for the king. That's more experience than I've got." He gave a short bark of laughter. I know how to kill knights. That's about the only thing I'm good for." He fell silent for a moment, then took another swig from the wineskin. "If that's what you want," he said quietly, "I'll come with you, but let's not rush into the jaws of 1,000 armed men just yet. Girl, we'll get ourselves killed." A faint smile tugged at the corner of Arya's lips. "No," she said, "not yet." The rain finally started outside, pattering against the rocky ground. She pulled her cloak tighter and turned her gaze to the fire. Someday, though. In the weeks that followed, they ventured deeper into the Vale, forging a path through smaller passes, avoiding major roads. They did odd things to sustain themselves. Sometimes hunting game, sometimes robbing an unscrupulous merchant who tried to cheat them, sometimes doing small jobs for a local crofter in exchange for fresh water and a roof for a night. Sandor's limp improved. Though his face was drawn from the pain, he must have still felt. Arya's sword arm grew stronger, her reflexes quicker. She practiced each day with needle, running through the water-dancing form Sirio Farrell had taught her, though she adapted them to real fights with the help of the Hound's brutal advice. They had arguments, some fierce, over whether they should kill certain travelers, or whether they should help a small band of refugees fleeing from rumored raids in the Eastern Vale. Arya sometimes insisted on showing mercy, which the Hound derided as foolish. He, in turn, occasionally displayed a cynical generosity, tossing a coin to a crippled beggar, or scaring off a group of brigands from terrorizing a small farm. When Arya questioned him, he'd growl that it was none of her business, or that he just wanted to kill those brigands himself. She sensed the contradiction in him, the flicker of decency buried under layers of bitterness. Winter crept ever closer, chilling the nights. They trudged along mountain paths covered in early snow. Their horses, half-starved, had to pick carefully over ice-slick rocks. Arya felt the cold seep into her bones, reminding her of Winterfell. She dreamt sometimes of her old home, of her room and the safety of the walls. She dreamt also of Nymeria, her lost direwolf, wondering if the wolf still roamed the wilderness with her pack. In waking life, though, her companion was Sandor Clegane, the Hound. He was no direwolf, but they understood each other in a wordless way that gave Arya a sense of belonging she had lost long ago. One frigid evening, they sought shelter in the ruins of a burned-out sept, perched high on a rocky shelf. The stone walls offered some protection from the wind, and the charred timbers indicated that it had been destroyed in some skirmish months or years prior. A tattered tapestry of the seven hung limp and singed. Arya gathered broken pews for firewood, building a small blaze. Outside, the wind howled like a living thing. The Hound took watch at one of the gaping windows, sword across his lap, scanning the darkness for threats. She settled near the fire, pulling her cloak around her. "There's not much left of the Vale," she mused quietly, glancing around the blackened stones. "War has touched every corner." He nodded, not turning from his vigil. "War touched everything. You Starks had your share of it." She didn't bother to correct him, to say that she wasn't a Stark, that she was no one, or that she was a wolf. Those titles felt jumbled in her head now. Instead, she asked, "What do you think we should do next?" He was silent for a few moments, then he sighed. "We can't stay in these mountains forever. Sooner or later, winter snows will block the passes. We could head west, try the Riverlands, or even further north to the Neck. But that's not exactly safe either." He paused, looking at her. "You're still set on finding your sister, or some piece of your family?" Arya met his gaze. She knew this was a pivotal question. "Yes," she said. "If Sansa's still alive somewhere in the Vale, I want to find out. And even if she's not, I can't wander forever without knowing." He He scratched the scarred side of his face. Fine. Then we do it carefully. Find someone in the Vale who knows what's happening at the Eyrie, who's in charge, how many men they have. We do it quietly so we're not marching up to the gate with a sign that says kill us. If it turns out your sister's gone, or it's too dangerous, we back off. Arya nodded, relief flooding her. She wasn't sure why his agreement mattered so much, but it did. They finished their conversation, letting the fire crackle. The hush of the burned sept felt almost like a tomb, a relic of a faith that no longer seemed to keep people safe. By the time the storm passed in the early morning, they were left with a dusting of fresh snow. They saddled up and moved on, forging a plan to gather information from smaller holdfasts or travelers they encountered. The next fortnight saw them creeping closer to the heart of the Vale, descending from the higher passes into more populated valleys. They learned that Lord Yohn Royce was rallying men in the region, uncertain about Littlefinger's hold on the young Lord Robin Arryn. Rumors abounded about intrigues at the Eyrie, though Sansa Stark was not named publicly. Arya gleaned scraps of gossip. A beautiful young cousin of Robin Arryn was rumored to be kept out of sight, or that Lord Baelish planned to wed some northern girl to secure alliances. The Hound was particularly cautious, reminding Arya that if Sansa was truly there, Baelish would not advertise it. The man was cunning, manipulative. They decided to approach one of Royce's men, hoping to learn more. Under cover of dusk, they slipped into a small garrison village that housed some of Royce's soldiers. They left the horses tethered in a grove, then crept into the village on foot. Arya wore a plain hood, her clothes dusty from the road, while the Hound hid in the shadows. They had planned to overhear talk in one of the local taverns, but the moment Arya stepped into the smoky interior, conversation paused. A handful of soldiers sat around wooden tables, cups of ale in hand. One large man looked up, eyes narrowed. She forced herself to remain calm, stepping over to the bar to order a drink with one of the last coppers she possessed. It wasn't long before the large man approached. He loomed behind her. "You're a bit young to be wandering alone," he said, voice suspicious. "And I don't recall seeing your face around here." Arya sipped her ale, it tasted rancid, and shrugged. "I'm just a messenger traveling for my master," she lied. "I need a bed for the night, and then I'll be off." The soldier eyed her carefully, taking in the sword at her side. "A messenger who carries a blade, right? Who do you serve, then?" She hesitated. "House Belmore," she said, recalling a Vale House name she'd heard in passing. "I've come from Strongsong." He seemed unconvinced, opening his mouth to ask another question when the tavern door banged open, letting in a gust of cold air and the Hound. He moved with casual menace, scanning the room. Arya's stomach lurched. He was supposed to stay outside, waiting, but apparently he'd decided she was taking too long. The soldier followed her gaze and froze as Sandor stepped forward. The hush was deafening. A half-dozen men in the tavern turned their heads, eyes widening. The largest soldier's face twisted in recognition. "Gods be good. It's the Hound," he whispered. Another soldier shot to his feet, reaching for his sword. "There's a bounty on your head, Clegane. You're a criminal." The tension snapped like a drawn bowstring. In one motion, the Hound unsheathed his sword. Arya sprang back, drawing needle. Chairs screeched across the floor as men scrambled to react. The barkeep yelled a protest, diving behind the counter. The first soldier swung at Sandor, but the Hound parried, twisted, and slammed the pommel into the man's face. He fell with a crash, table splintering under his weight. Two others rushed at once, and Arya darted in with needle, slicing one's forearm. He yelped, dropping his weapon. The other soldier, bigger and more cautious, circled around, trying to flank the Hound, but Sandor pivoted, using the fallen man's body as a shield, then lunged forward to impale him. Blood soaked the tavern floor. A soldier at the back notched an arrow to a bow, aiming at Sandor's exposed back. Arya spotted him and lunged, knocking the archer's arm upward. The arrow loosed into the ceiling. The archer cursed, swinging the bow at Arya, but she ducked, striking with needle. The point caught the man's side. Another arrow clattered to the ground. He collapsed, moaning. In seconds, it was over. 3 men lay dead or dying, and 2 more were badly injured, groaning on the tavern floor. The barkeep trembled behind the counter, hands over his head. Arya panted, chest heaving, adrenaline flooding her veins. The Hound stood in the center of the wreckage, sword dripping red. He glanced at her, ensuring she was unharmed. She nodded, wiping a splatter of blood from her cheek. Shouts sounded outside. Arya realized that more soldiers might be stationed nearby. "We have to go," she hissed. Sandor jerked his head in agreement. He grabbed a cloak from one of the fallen men and tossed it around his shoulders. Then together they rushed out into the cold night. Darkness had settled fully, but lanterns flickered around the village, and they heard the stomp of boots on the road. A half-dozen armed men were converging on the tavern from 2 different streets. Arya and the Hound sprinted into an alley, weaving between crates and barrels. One soldier spotted them and yelled. They kept running, turning corners until they reached the outskirts, where the village butted against a thick patch of forest. "The horses," Arya gasped. "This way," Sandor grunted, leading her across a narrow ditch. They vaulted a low fence and plunged into the trees. Shouts and torches flickered behind them, but the forest was dark. The branches clawed at their faces, and the uneven ground threatened to trip them. Arya heard the pounding of her heart in her ears. After minutes of desperate scrambling, they reached the small grove where they'd tethered the horses. The animals whinnied, skittish from the commotion. The Hound swung into his saddle, ignoring the flare of pain in his healing leg, and Arya scrambled onto her mount. They drove the horses forward, deeper into the forest, away from the road. Torches bobbed in the distance as soldiers tried to track them, but the pair knew how to vanish. For hours, they pressed on through the darkness, branches snapping underfoot, crossing a shallow creek to mask their trail. Eventually, when the moon was high, they stopped in a secluded clearing, dismounting to catch their breath. Their lungs burned, and the horses heaved. Arya patted her mare's neck, murmuring a soothing word. The Hound sank against a tree trunk, wincing as he shifted his weight off his bad leg. Blood and grime stained his clothes. He looked at Arya with a hard expression. "7 hells, that was close," he said, though she could tell he was more angry than frightened. "So much for quietly gathering information." She let out a breathless laugh, the surge of tension making her giddy. "They recognized you. Maybe I should have gone alone." He glared at her, but there was no real malice in his eyes. "And let them corner you by yourself?" He shook his head. "They'd have skewered you eventually." Arya sheathed needle, feeling exhaustion seep into her limbs. Her heart still pounded from the fight. "We didn't learn anything," she said, frustration creeping into her tone. "All that risk, and we're no closer to finding out if Sansa's in the area." He blew out a long breath, wincing as he pressed a hand to a cut on his arm. "We know they're loyal to Royce, and they see Baelish as, well, uncertain. If your sister is there, she's in the middle of a viper's nest." He paused, glancing at her. "What do you plan to do now? Storm the area by yourself?" She ground her teeth, looking out into the dark woods. "I don't know," she admitted. "We can't just walk in. We can't pass ourselves off as travelers anymore. They're on alert." She rubbed her temples. "Maybe we head north around the mountains, try to come in from another direction. Or we find a place to lay low until the search for us cools. Then we can try again." Sandor nodded, though the set of his shoulders was weary. "We're not unstoppable," he muttered. "So far, luck has kept us alive as much as our blades. The more we stir up trouble, the more men will come for us." He eyed her with a hint of concern, which he tried to mask with a scowl. "We need a better plan, or we'll end up as 2 corpses in the snow." She swallowed, knowing he was right. She hated the feeling of being so close to the area, where Sansa might be, and still so far from a real chance to see her. But she also knew they couldn't just charge headlong. "We'll think of something," she said, her tone resolute. "One step at a time." We've come this far, haven't we? He gave a low grunt, resting his head against the rough bark of the tree. The night was cold, and their breath formed ghosts in the air. They put together a crude camp, no fire this time, wary of attracting attention. Arya tried to sleep, but her mind raced with the memory of the tavern brawl, of the men lying in blood, and the intangible promise of her sister somewhere beyond the high towers of the Vale. She glanced at the Hound, who dozed fitfully against his saddle. A wave of strange gratitude washed over her. Despite all the death, the hunger, the bitterness, he was there, an anchor of sorts in this violent world. Days turned into weeks again. They skirted the Vale's more populated areas, doubling back westward, crossing into the edges of the riverlands. The land was scarred from the war, dotted with burnt farms and roving outlaws. But the heavy snows had not yet come in force. They managed to evade any large patrols, though now and then they clashed with desperate bandits or suspicious locals. Word of the Hound and a young she-wolf occasionally preceded them, so they traveled with great caution. Sometimes Arya wondered if this was her fate. To wander forever, a sword in hand, no home to return to. She remembered the house of black and white, the lure of becoming no one. But she'd made her choice when she left Bravos, or rather, never got there in this timeline. Her path had taken a different course alongside Sandor. One gray afternoon, after a string of quiet days, they approached a small inn on the outskirts of a once prosperous village. Arya's horse was limping with a loose shoe, and she knew they needed rest, maybe a blacksmith if one could be found. They dismounted a fair distance away, creeping closer to check for signs of danger. The inn's thatched roof was battered, but smoke rose from the chimney. Horses were tied outside, though not many. The Hound surveyed the area from behind a clump of bushes. "Don't see a guard or a patrol," he said quietly. "We could chance it. I'm sick of sleeping under trees." Arya nodded. They agreed to hide his distinctive helm. He still kept it in their packs, though rarely wore it, and keep his face in the shadow of his hood. She would do most of the talking. If trouble started, they'd slip out a back window or fight their way free. So they led their horses to the stable, paying the stable boy a few coins to care for the animals. Then they stepped into the inn, blinking against the flickering torchlight. Inside, a few patrons hunched over bowls of stew, and the innkeeper, a stout woman with a friendly face, beckoned them. "Come in, travelers, out of the cold." She motioned to a table near the fireplace. "We've got hot stew and fresh bread. Rooms, if you're wanting them." Arya forced a small smile. "That would be good," she said, keeping her voice even. "We've come a long way and need a day's rest." The Hound settled at the table with a silent grunt. Arya handed the innkeeper a silver coin, which made the woman's eyes widen. "We'd also like to see if there's a blacksmith for my horse's shoe," she added. The woman nodded enthusiastically. "Our stable boy doubles as a blacksmith's apprentice. He can fix it for you. No worries." She bustled off, presumably to fetch stew. Arya slid into a seat, pulling her cloak around her. She felt warm air against her cheeks for the first time in days. Her eyes swept the room. Only a couple of travelers. A pair of tired merchants, from the look of them, and a hooded figure in a corner, who sipped slowly from a cup. The place seemed peaceful enough. The Hound kept his head down, but she sensed he was on high alert as always. Not long after, the innkeeper returned with 2 bowls of steaming stew, thick with barley and carrots, along with a loaf of bread still warm from the oven. Arya's stomach growled, and she realized how hungry she was. She tore off a piece of bread, dipping it in the stew, the savory smell enveloping her. The Hound ate in silence, occasionally glancing up to scan the room. They were nearly finished with their meal when the hooded figure in the corner stood and approached their table. Arya's hand slid toward Needle out of habit, but the figure paused at a respectful distance. When he drew back his hood, Arya's eyes widened. He was an older man, perhaps in his 50s, with gray streaks in his hair and a lined face. But his eyes were intense, calculating. She had the strangest sense that he recognized them, though she didn't recall him. "Begging your pardon," he said, his voice quiet and measured. "I couldn't help but notice your blade, girl. finer steel than one often sees in these parts. Might I inquire as to your name? Sandor tensed, his hand closing around the hilt of his sword beneath the table. Arya swallowed. We're just travelers, she said. We have no name to give. Why do you ask? The man offered a thin smile. No offense meant. I simply have an interest in fine blades, especially those from the north. His eyes flicked to Sandor's cloaked figure. And I think I know a Northman when I see one, or at least someone who once served a northern house. Arya's heart hammered. She thought of lying again, claiming they were from the Reach or the Stormlands, but she sensed this man might see through it. We don't want trouble, she said in a low voice. He lifted both hands, palms outward. Neither do I. Forgive me, I simply recognized a certain stance, a certain spirit. You carry yourself like a wolf. At that, the Hound's grip tightened. Arya stared at the man, suspicion roiling in her gut. What do you want? She demanded. The man's gaze flicked around, ensuring no one else was listening. The merchants were involved in their own conversation, and the innkeeper was in the kitchen. Finally, he leaned in slightly. I want to help, he said softly. If you are who I think you are, you might be in need of assistance. The roads are not safe, especially for a young Stark. Arya went cold. You're mistaken, she said automatically, though her voice betrayed her uncertainty. He studied her face, then glanced at the Hound. Perhaps so, he allowed. But if not, know that there are those in the Vale who would help you. Not everyone is loyal to Lord Baelish. Some recall the honor of House Stark and the tragedies that befell it. He paused. Lord Jon Royce is a good man, proud and stern. If you can speak to him, he might offer you sanctuary. If that is what you desire. Arya felt a swirl of conflicting emotions. Hope, suspicion, fear. And how do I know I can trust you? She asked. He gave a wry smile. You don't. But I can say that if I wanted your bounty, or the Hound's, I could have alerted the entire inn or the local lord. Instead, I came to speak to you quietly. Take from that what you will. Sandor's eyes narrowed from beneath his hood. He spoke in a gravelly hiss. And who are you, old man? The man bowed his head slightly. Merely a wanderer who once served in the retinue of House Royce. I still carry loyalty to them, though I am no longer in their service. My name is Garrett Stone. The name rang no bells for Arya, but it sounded plausible as a Vale bastard name. Garrett Stone. Arya measured his calm demeanor. He showed no fear, even though the Hound loomed dangerously. Carefully, she said, if we wanted to find Lord Royce, how would we do it? He glanced at the door. He's moved to a keep called Runestone, near the coast, a fair distance east of here. But you should know the roads will be watched. If you truly are Arya Stark, you're not the only one seeking an audience. Word of your presence might spread quickly if you show your face openly. She swallowed. We appreciate the warning. Garrett Stone nodded. I'll say no more. If you decide to seek him out, you'll likely find a warmer welcome there than you might at the Eyrie. Just remember, Lord Baelish will have his watchers. He dipped his head once more, then turned and walked away, taking his seat in the corner again, as though nothing had happened. Arya exchanged a look with the Hound. She could see uncertainty in his eyes. They'd come searching for Sansa at the Eyrie, but now they had an option to seek out Jon Royce at Runestone. He was a known bannerman to House Arryn, but also rumored to be a man of integrity. Could it be a chance to gain real allies, people who wouldn't turn them in for a bounty? Or was it a trap? She said nothing, finishing the last of her bread in silence. The Hound watched Garrett Stone warily from beneath his hood. When the innkeeper emerged, cheerful as before, they asked for a room, intending to stay the night. The old man in the corner made no move to follow them. Still, Arya felt his presence like a weight. She wondered if their luck had finally changed, or if they were stepping into another pit of vipers. That night, in the small cramped room on the second floor of the inn, Arya lay on the straw mattress, listening to the wind rattle the shutters. The Hound sat by the door as if standing guard. "What do you think?" she whispered, so no one outside could hear. "Should we go to Runestone?" He let out a breath. Lord Yon Royce might help you, or he might hand me over for the bounty, or hand us both over. A man of honor could still see me as a murderer. She tugged her cloak around her shoulders. Maybe we can win him over. If not, we leave. She thought about Sansa, about the possibility that news could spread from Runestone to the Eyrie. Perhaps Sansa would hear that Arya lived. Perhaps they could arrange a meeting. So many perhaps. The Hound rubbed a hand over his beard, deep in thought. "We can try," he said finally, his voice resigned but determined. "But we do it on our terms, quietly. If it smells like a trap, we cut our losses." Arya nodded, relief mingling with apprehension. "Right," she said. They lapsed into silence, each lost in their own tangle of thoughts. The only certainty was that they would continue forward together. She recalled the moment when she'd nearly left him to die, so long ago. Now, they were a pair of outcasts, a lethal duo forging a path across a war-torn land. If she had left him then, she would be alone now or dead. Perhaps fate had its reasons for binding a wolf girl and a burned hound together. Soon, her eyelids grew heavy, lulled by the warmth of the inn's meager comfort. The Hound stood watch, sword across his lap. Outside, winter's icy hand crept closer each day. Somewhere, in a lofty keep or a snow-covered courtyard, Arya's sister might be waiting. Or perhaps waiting was too gentle a word. Maybe Sansa was surviving, maneuvering in Littlefinger's web. Whatever the truth, Arya Stark would find it, with the Hound at her side. The night deepened, and both drifted in fitful dreams, anticipating the trials yet to come. They had already spilled blood across half of Westeros. If the snows came and the White Walkers stirred in the far north, they might spill more. But for now, a flicker of hope lived in the possibility of finding a sister and forging an alliance. Such hope was fragile in a place like Westeros, but then again, Arya Stark had always been a survivor, and so had Sandor Clegane. If the roads were paved with corpses, then they would leave footprints among them, forging onward, side by side, as a wolf and a hound, a lethal duo with no master but themselves. No one could say what the morrow would bring, but as Arya drifted off to sleep in that humble inn, she clung to the thought that, for once, she wasn't entirely alone in this broken world, and that perhaps she and the Hound could carve out something resembling a victory from the chaos. Together, they would decide their own fate. Arya woke to the patter of rain on the inn's shutters, each droplet tapping out a steady rhythm that lulled her in and out of hazy half-dreams. Dawn had not yet come, but a faint gray light seeped through the cracks in the wooden boards. In the corner, where he had dozed upright, the Hound was already stirring. He stood with a grunt, rolling his shoulders as if to chase away aches gained from a lifetime of battles and a night spent in a cramped room. She watched him for a moment before pulling her own cloak around her and swinging her feet to the floor. The straw mattress rustled, and the damp air brushed her face. They'd stayed in this inn longer than they usually dared. Most times, a single night's rest was enough to risk someone seeing through Sandor's hood or noticing Arya's too keen stare. But the old man's words from the night before still rattled around in Arya's head, mixing with curiosity and a grim sense of duty. If this Garrett Stone was telling the truth, if Lord Yon Royce at Runestone could be a friend, perhaps they finally had a real lead. The Hound glanced her way, scarred face partially hidden in the dimness. "Your horse's shoe is sorted," he said in a low rasp. "I went down to the stable an hour ago. That boy hammered it back on. Says it'll hold well enough for a while." She nodded. "Good. Then we can leave soon." She rose and ran a hand through her tangled hair. "Garrett Stone is probably still downstairs, or maybe he's gone. I don't know if we should speak to him again." Sandor shook his head. "We've risked enough by staying. We pay the innkeeper for last night. Slip out quick. We don't want to draw attention." He paused, letting a hint of doubt drift across his expression. "You really mean to head east? Toward Runestone?" Arya tugged on her boots. "Yes," she said quietly. "I need answers. If Lord Royce is truly honorable, maybe he can help me find Sansa, or even tell me if she is alive. If it's a trap, We'll handle it like we have before." He said nothing, only nodded once. They gathered their belongings, slipping weapons under cloaks. Arya belted needle around her waist, checking the feel of the blade. A tingle ran through her fingertips. She recalled the night before, how easily violence had erupted in the Vale's tavern when soldiers recognized the Hound. She expected no less from the road ahead. In a world like this, peace was seldom more than a fleeting respite. They left the room, treading softly down the creaking staircase into the inn's common room. The smell of hot bread wafted from the hearth, and the innkeeper, wiping mugs at a worn table, offered them a quick smile. "Good morning, travelers," she said. "Heading out already? Storm's letting up, but you'll get a bit damp on the road." Arya mustered a polite nod, pulling her hood over her hair to hide her face. She laid a few coins on the table. "Thanks for the room and the meal," she murmured. The innkeeper swept up the coins with brisk efficiency. "Safe travels," she called, turning back to her chores. Garrett Stone was nowhere in sight. Arya felt a twinge of relief, mingled with the faint regret of an unanswered question. Could he really have been a friend, or was he just another manipulator testing them? She found herself unreasonably glad not to have to decide. The fewer complications, the better. Outside, a thin mist of rain brushed their faces as they crossed the yard to the stable. Their horses waited in adjacent stalls. Arya's mare, lean and dark, flicked her ears anxiously at the sound of distant thunder. Sandor's mount, a larger chestnut with battle scars of its own, stomped the straw. Arya glanced around for the stable boy, wanting to confirm the shoe was secure, but there was no one about. She lifted the mare's hoof, saw that the iron shoe was indeed hammered tight. Satisfied, she slung her pack across the saddle and mounted up. Sandor did the same, wincing only slightly. His leg had healed enough that he managed the motion without much trouble these days. They rode out as dawn's first true light crept into the sky. Thick clouds loomed overhead, and the muddy roads glistened from overnight rains. The air held a sting of chill, as though winter hovered just behind the drizzle, ready to bury the land under snow. Arya guided her horse along the track heading eastward. She glanced over her shoulder once, half expecting to see Garrett Stone or some group of armed men pursuing them. The road, however, remained empty except for puddles and shrouds of mist. Sandor's horse clopped beside hers, slow and steady. "If we're truly making for Runestone," he said, keeping his voice down even though no one was near, "it's near the coast. We'll have a long ride through mountains and hills. Most direct route is to pass by the southern edges of the Mountains of the Moon, then loop north. That means crossing some major roads. More towns, more soldiers." Arya nodded. She'd studied rough maps in Winterfell's library when she was younger, but she didn't recall every detail. "We could skirt them," she suggested. "Look for smaller passes. It'll take longer, but with luck, we won't have to kill anyone who recognizes you." He gave a dry snort. "You might be recognized too, you know? You're not just some nameless whelp anymore. If someone catches a glimpse of those gray eyes and that sword style, the wrong tongues might wag." Her jaw set. "Then we'll be careful." They continued in silence for several miles, the muddy trail winding between rolling hills dotted with leafless trees. Now and then, a forlorn farmhouse broke the monotony, windows boarded or burnt out from raids. Ravens circled overhead, cawing. Arya stared at the ravens for a moment, remembering how they'd once served as messengers from Maester Luwin's rookery. Now, they merely seemed to symbolize the chaos left in war's wake. By midday, they found a narrow footpath veering southeast, away from the main track. A broken signpost, half-rotted, pointed in an indeterminate direction. They took it, trusting that it would lead them away from heavily traveled roads. The land rose gently, and the path meandered up slopes lined with stony outcroppings. The drizzle eased, but the sky remained gray. A few hours on, they came across a small shepherd's hut perched on a hillside. A rickety fence contained a couple of bleeding goats. Smoke rose lazily from the hut's chimney. Arya's stomach growled. She and Sandor had eaten nothing but a few crusts of the inn's bread that morning. They reined in, scanning the area. Sandor's voice was low. "Think it's safe?" Arya hesitated. They had enough coins left for a bit of food, but not many. And they both knew that if the shepherd recognized the Hound or identified Arya, it could turn into another bloodbath. She sighed. "We can try. You stay here, keep watch. I'll go see if there's anything to buy." He gave a stiff nod. "Shout if you need me." Arya dismounted, leaving him and the horses behind a small copse of wind-snarled trees. With Needle at her hip, she walked toward the hut, stepping carefully over rocks and worn tufts of grass. The goats brayed as she approached, but she only paused to look at them a moment before knocking on the crooked wooden door. Took a few heartbeats before the door creaked open. A stooped woman, her face etched with lines of worry and age, peered out. "Who's there?" she demanded, voice wavering between fear and suspicion. Arya tried a small smile. "Just a traveler. I've silver if you have cheese or dried meat to spare." The woman narrowed her eyes. "You alone?" Arya shrugged. "My companion is back there, seeing to the horses." She gestured vaguely, offering no more details. "We won't trouble you if you've nothing to sell." Something in the old woman's expression shifted. Perhaps the mention of silver or the glimmer of desperation that sometimes drove folks to trade with strangers. She opened the door wider, revealing a cramped interior with a meager fire in a stone hearth. "I might have some goat cheese," she said grudgingly. "A bit of salted pork left, though not much. The wars VE left us all hungry." Arya nodded. "How much for the cheese and pork?" The woman squinted, then seemed to decide on a price. 3 silver stags. Arya knew it was robbery in simpler times, but these days everything was scarce. She produced the coins from the purse she kept close, feeling the pang of how few remained. The woman's wrinkled hand snatched them quickly, as though half afraid Arya would change her mind. Then she turned to rummage in a small cupboard, pulling out a cloth bundle with a hunk of cheese and a smaller piece of salted meat. Taking the bundle, Arya tucked it into her satchel. "Thank you," she said. For a second, she caught the woman eyeing her face, perhaps noticing her youth or some detail about her northern accent. Arya offered a brief nod and stepped back. "Safe to you," she added, unsure what else to say. The door shut. The goats continued bleating. Arya returned to Sandor, who eyed the bundle like a wolf that hadn't eaten in days. She handed him the salted pork, kept the cheese for herself. They ate in silence, the tangy bite of goat cheese awakening her taste buds. The Hound chewed the pork, then glanced at her. "Best we keep moving. If she gets any ideas and sells our description to the next wandering group of knights, it won't be good." Arya agreed. They mounted and rode on, the slope growing steeper, the path narrower. The day dragged into late afternoon, and they found themselves in a region of rocky hills, each separated by shallow, misty valleys. Birdsong was scarce, replaced by the constant wind sighing through cracks in the stone. This was the Vale in late autumn. Lonely, quiet, and haunted. They camped that night in a hollow beneath a stone ridge, building a small fire that they hid behind a ring of rocks. The goat's cheese and salted pork made for a scant meal, but it was better than hunger. Arya dozed with her cloak wrapped tight, half listening to the wind rattle across the ridge. The Hound kept watch, silent except for the occasional shift of his boots on gravel. The next morning dawned chill and foggy. They pressed on. Hours later, the path opened onto a vantage point overlooking a wide, forested valley. Beyond the valley's eastern edge, faintly visible in the distance, Arya glimpsed the glimmer of open water, the sea or part of it shrouded by haze. If memory served, Runestone was close to the coast, on a bay known for rocky shores. The direction seemed right. Sandor reined in. "Looks like we're getting closer to the coast. We'll need to find a pass down into that valley." They picked their way along a series of switchbacks that led downhill. Late in the afternoon, they reached a more substantial road that curved southward. A stone marker, half covered in moss, bore the sigil of House Royce. A runic bronze shield, though time had eroded the detail. Arya ran her fingers over the weathered carving. "This must be their domain," she murmured. We're on the right track. Sandor didn't look entirely enthusiastic. Aye, let's hope they're not rounding up every outlaw and sellsword who sets foot on it. Keep your eyes open. As they rode, they began to see more signs of habitation. A small orchard with leafless apple trees. A watchtower perched on a knoll, its windows flickering with torchlight at dusk. They avoided the watchtower by circling widely, preferring not to test the notion of whether the watchers might be friendly. Once fully dark, they made camp beneath the boughs of a pine grove. It was cold enough that they debated building a fire. In the end, they lit a small one, hidden by a ring of pine trunks. The forest floor was soft with needles, muting their footsteps and providing a bit of insulation. Near the faint glow of the flames, Arya unwrapped the last of their salted meat, dividing it between them. It was tough and chewy, but it kept the hunger at bay. She found her mind drifting to Winterfell, to how the kitchens had once been filled with the smells of fresh bread and roasted meats. A memory of her father carved across her thoughts, of him smiling over a simple meal, proud of his children. The wave of longing that came with it nearly choked her, but she swallowed it down, letting the moment pass. Sandor chewed methodically. We'll probably come to a real town tomorrow or the next day. Might be men loyal to Royce. Might be the same worthless sellswords who'll try to kill us for our bounty. Either way, if you want to talk to Royce, we'll have to do it soon. Arya nodded, gaze flickering to the dancing flames. We do it carefully, she said, echoing his own words from before. Ask around first. If they say Royce is at Runestone and has men patrolling, we'll see if we can get an audience, or send word, discreetly, that Arya Stark is alive and seeking his help. Sandor made a low sound in his throat, not quite agreement or disagreement. If we do that, Baelish's spies might catch wind. Arya stared at the fire, imagining Peter Baelish with his oily smile, his soft words concealing 1,000 schemes. If that happens, we'll handle it. We've come this far. She watched the Hound's expression shift in the firelight, the old burned scars rippling with each subtle movement. All right, girl. We'll handle it, he said, more resigned than confident. Then he rose, leaning on his good leg, and stepped away to check on the horses, leaving Arya alone with the crackle of flames. In that moment, despite his hulking presence nearby, she felt the weight of all she'd lost pressing on her heart. Sansa might be the only living Stark in reach, unless Bran or Rickon somehow lived in the north, or Jon still served with the Night's Watch. But none of that was certain. She had pinned her hopes on Sansa, no matter the complicated history between them. Eventually, Arya banked the fire low and settled in for sleep, trusting the Hound's watchful stance beyond the ring of trees. She drifted through uneasy dreams, of the twins and the Red Wedding, of the Hound bleeding out on a hill, of wolves running through dark forests, and crows perched in the canopy, their eyes gleaming white like ghosts. Morning found them stiff-limbed and cold. They saddled up, rubbing warmth into their hands, and followed the road deeper into the valley. By midday, the forest opened onto farmland. The fields lay dormant for winter, rows of pale stubble stretching away from the road. Farther on, they came to a village ringed by a crude wooden palisade. Thin plumes of smoke rose from within. A small gate, just wide enough for a wagon, stood open, but 2 guards in simple leather and boiled leather breastplates flanked it, each armed with a spear. Arya and the Hound reined in some distance away. The guards eyed them warily. One stepped forward. Halt. State your business. Arya glanced at Sandor. His face was hidden in the depths of his hood. She fixed the guard with what she hoped was a calm, neutral expression. We're travelers on the road, seeking rest and maybe a meal. We have coin. No trouble. The guard's gaze flicked from her to the tall figure beside her. Where do you come from? Sandor kept silent, letting Arya speak. She improvised. We were in the hills, trapping. My father and I. A slight hesitation. She'd hardly look like his daughter, but maybe it was dark enough under their cloaks to obscure detail. We heard there was a village ahead where we could trade pelts for supplies, maybe some winter gear. The roads haven't been good to us. The guard studied them a moment more. You'll find no pelts sold here. We're farmers. he said gruffly, but with less suspicion in his tone. But we've got an inn of sorts. Keep the peace, and you're welcome for the night. Arya nodded gratefully. We will. The guards stepped aside, letting them pass. They guided their horses through the gate into a modest cluster of huts and a single larger structure that might be the inn. She noted the looks they drew. Villagers paused in their tasks to stare at the newcomers, particularly the imposing figure of the Hound. But no one raised an alarm. Maybe out here, travelers were still occasional enough not to be too surprising. They dismounted in front of the larger building. A wooden sign depicting a chipped wheel of cheese hung over the door. A puzzling choice, but perhaps it was meant to suggest hospitality. The Hound exhaled, scanning the courtyard. The villagers had gone back to their chores, though a few curious eyes lingered. Arya led them inside, where a single large common room with benches and a hearth awaited. A middle-aged woman in a patched apron hurried over. "Welcome," she greeted. "We have bread and stew if you've coin. Not much else to offer these days." Arya placed a few coppers on the counter. "Stew and a bit of bread, please, and a place for the night if you have one." The woman's eyes darted to the Hound's hood, but she made no comment. "We've a loft above the stables if you don't mind sharing with a few hens," she said, sweeping up the coins. "We're a small village. You'll get no fancy chambers here. I'll bring you stew." She bustled off to the back. Arya took a seat at one of the benches, and the Hound sat across from her, arms folded, head lowered. The smell of simmering onions and cabbage drifted through the room, mixed with smoke from the fire. A pair of local men sat at another bench, quietly talking in subdued voices. When the innkeeper returned, she placed 2 wooden bowls of thin stew before them, along with a loaf of coarse bread. Arya mumbled thanks and dipped a spoon in. It was watery but warm. Her belly growled at the taste of something hot and fresh. They ate in silence, ignoring the few curious stares. When they'd finished, Arya dabbed her mouth on a sleeve. She waited until the innkeeper returned to collect the empty bowls, then ventured carefully. "We've come a long way. Heard that runestone's near these parts. Is that so?" The innkeeper shrugged. "Aye, you could say so. To the northeast, near the coast. Belongs to Lord Royce." She paused, eyeing Arya. "You've business there?" Arya feigned casual ignorance. "Maybe. We've heard they've got better markets than we'll find in the hills, and my father's thinking of trading our furs." She gestured vaguely at Sandor. "Is it far?" The woman took the bowls under her arm. "If you take the road north of here, then east for a day or two, you'll come to the main gates of Runestone. But be warned, Royce's men have tightened security. They say outlaws roam the Vale, and the roads near the coast can be dangerous, smugglers, sellswords looking for coin. You'll want to keep your wits about you." Arya nodded, heart beating a little faster. "Thank you. We appreciate the advice." The woman gave a distracted smile, then turned to tend to something else. Arya leaned forward, lowering her voice for the Hound. "So it's 2 days, maybe 3. Then we'll be at Runestone's gates." Sandor glanced at her. "And you plan to ride up to the gates and say you're Arya Stark? How do you see that going?" Arya tapped her fingers on the bench, thinking. "I'm not sure. If we just show up, we might be seized, depending on whether they recognize you or trust me. Or we might be turned away. Lord Royce might not believe me without proof. I don't exactly carry a letter of introduction, and I doubt my name alone will convince him." Sandor grunted. "Truth is, you look enough like a Stark. The question is whether they'll believe a Stark is traveling with the Hound." She let out a small sigh. "I could go alone. Slip inside, speak to Royce directly." Even as she spoke the words, she sensed his objection. Indeed, Sandor's brow furrowed, and the tension in his jaw told her what he thought of that plan. "You'd walk unguarded into a lord's castle? I've seen you fight, girl, but that's more risk than you might know. If it goes wrong, you'll end up locked in a cell or on a pike, or worse, delivered straight to Baelish for ransom." Arya pursed her lips. "And if we both go, the risk doubles. You heard that innkeeper, there are rumors of outlaws. They might be on high alert for a scarred man with a big sword. Maybe we can find a subtle way in, or at least a messenger we can trust." He shook his head. Trust is in short supply. Then he jerked his chin toward the door. Come on, let's see the stable loft. We'll figure it out in the morning. They left the common room, stepping out into the waning light of evening. The stable was a simple wooden structure behind the inn's main building, with a partial second level for hay storage. A ladder led up to the loft. Inside, the floor was covered in straw, and a few plump hens clucked in corners. The smell of manure was strong, but it was better than sleeping in the open during a cold night. Arya led her mare inside and found a stall. The Hound did the same with his horse, then climbed the ladder to the loft to toss down some hay for bedding. The stable boy, a freckled youth with straw-colored hair, appeared, carrying a wooden bucket of water. He gave Sandor and Arya an uncertain glance but said nothing, quietly tending to the animals. Arya watched him for a moment, imagining how different her life would be if she'd grown up as a stable hand, never knowing the weight of a sword or the ache of vengeance. But that was a child's dream. Winterfell felt so far away that she could hardly recall the shape of its walls. Soon enough, they settled in the loft, clearing a corner where they spread cloaks for bedding. The hens fluttered away, muttering in soft clucks. A single lantern hung from a nail in a beam, casting flickering shadows. Arya stretched out, trying to ignore the smell. The Hound sat across from her, his back against a wooden post, arms crossed over his chest. Outside, the wind sighed against the palisade walls. They could hear distant voices, villagers finishing their day's work. Arya wondered if any of them recognized the danger that lay behind the stable door. The Hound was a man shaped by violence, known across kingdoms for the terror of his sword. She was a stark girl who had spilled more blood than many soldiers. Yet here they sat, quietly breathing in the dusty gloom, too tired for conversation. When the hush became too thick, Arya broke it. Tomorrow we'll ride on. Maybe find one more place to stay along the way, then arrive at Runestone by afternoon of the next day. That's what I'm thinking, at least. Sandor gave a curt nod. We'll see if the roads let us move that fast. These days, I expect trouble on any stretch of road. She closed her eyes, letting her thoughts drift to Sansa. If Sansa was truly a captive of Littlefinger, or bound to him by fear, maybe Yohn Royce could intervene. But the Vale had its own politics and allegiances, and no lord, honorable or not, could act without weighing the consequences. She recalled how men had once praised the Starks for their honor, then betrayed them in an instant when the Lannisters or the Boltons offered gold or power. What would keep Royce from doing the same? She had to hope his reputation held weight, that the old man Garrett Stone hadn't been lying. Fatigue tugged at her. She pulled her cloak tighter, curling on the straw. The Hound doused the lantern, plunging them into darkness broken only by the faint glow of moonlight through cracks in the boards. She felt him shift to find a comfortable position against the post. Then silence fell. Sleep came slowly, visited by flickers of old memories. The House of Black and White, the Braavosi docks, the roar of crowds in King's Landing, the loneliness of the King's Road. Through every vision, the Hound's scarred face or menacing silhouette intruded, as if her mind could no longer separate his presence from her own story. Morning dawned cold and cheerless. The palisade gates were opened for the day, and farmers trickled out to tend their fields. Arya and Sandor roused themselves, fed the horses what little feed they could afford, and left the stable loft behind. The innkeeper offered them a morsel of bread for breakfast, more out of pity than anything else, and they rode from the village without incident. The next day's travel was marked by slate-gray skies and the rise of a stiff breeze from the east. As the miles passed, they began to see farmland give way to rougher, rockier ground interspersed with patches of forest. The sea's presence grew more tangible, the air carrying a faint briny tang. Here and there, they spotted small gulls or other seabirds wheeling overhead, crying into the wind. By late afternoon, the road curved around a bend, and they caught their first proper glimpse of the water. A wide bay stretching into the distance, choppy waves flecked with white under the dreary sky. The horizon blurred with cloud. Arya paused her mare, letting the wind whip her cloak. "We're getting close," she said. raising her voice over the gust. "Runestone is somewhere along this coast." Sandor shielded his face from the wind with one hand. "Let's hope there's an inn or a stable soon. I'm tired of sleeping in muddy corners." His tone was half gruff, half resigned. They continued along the road, which now followed the coastline at a slight distance. After another hour, they spotted a structure on a promontory, a squat tower of dark stone, possibly a watchtower or a minor holdfast. A single banner hung from a pole, snapping in the wind. Even from here, Arya could see the bronze coloration of House Royce's sigil. She felt a twist of nerves in her belly. "Careful," Sandor muttered. "Let's not ride straight into them." They guided their horses off the main road, skirting around the tower at a respectful distance, picking their way over rocky terrain. As they crept by, Arya could make out a handful of men patrolling the tower's perimeter. They wore cloaks with the Royce emblem. The men didn't seem to notice the travelers who had ventured off-road, or if they did notice, they made no move to chase them. Once past the tower, the land sloped down toward a thin strip of beach. The crashing of waves grew louder, and the taste of salt lingered in the air. In the distance, across a small bay, the rocky rise of a fortress perched on a low cliff overlooking the sea, gray walls melding with the gloom. Arya's heart skipped. She remembered reading about Runestone in old accounts of Vale history, how it was ancient and formidable, carved from a stony headland centuries ago. "That must be it," she said, pointing. "Runestone." The Hound narrowed his eyes. "Looks unwelcoming." They found a vantage point among stunted trees, where they could watch the fortress from afar. The walls were high, the gatehouse broad. A small settlement clustered at the base of the keep, wooden houses and a market square, with a harbor beyond where fishing boats rocked at anchor. Even from a distance, Arya could see signs of fortification. Armed guards patrolling the walls, watchtowers with flickers of torchlight. House Royce was clearly on alert. Night was coming fast, the sun a pale smudge sinking into the horizon. They retreated into the cover of a small copse, making camp. Dinner was hard bread and water again, the last of their goat cheese gone. Arya looked at the fortress through the trees, its distant towers outlined against a stormy sky. "In the morning, we'll ride to that settlement," she said softly. "We'll see if we can find some way to contact Lord Royce or his steward without drawing too much attention." Sandor exhaled. "And if they arrest us on sight, I hope you've got a plan." Arya didn't answer. She felt the tension knotting in her shoulders. Since leaving the inn where Garrettstone first told them about Royce, she'd turned over a dozen possible strategies. None seemed guaranteed. All she had was the name of Arya Stark, a battered sword, and a battered companion. She couldn't rely on cunning alone, and she couldn't rely on fearsome reputation. There was no telling how the Royces felt about the Hound or about the wars in the north. They slept fitfully, lulled by the distant crash of waves. At dawn, a storm rolled in from the sea, bringing sheets of cold rain that turned the ground slippery. Undeterred, they mounted up and made their way toward the settlement at Runestone's foot. As they approached, the road turned into a muddy lane lined with a few scattered huts. Smoke rose from chimneys. Fishermen in cloaks trudged out to check their boats, cursing the weather. Ahead loomed the gates of the settlement's modest wooden palisade, which extended around the hamlet and up to the fortress walls. Two guards stood under a rain-soaked canopy. Each wore the bronze-embossed cloak of House Royce. They looked bored but alert, eyeing Arya and Sandor's approach. Arya pulled her hood forward to shield her face from the rain, letting water drip from the edge. At a slight gesture from Sandor, they halted a dozen yards back. "Halt!" one guard called. "State your name and purpose." Arya took a steadying breath. "We're here to trade," she said, raising her voice over the downpour. "Shelter from the storm. We've come from the west." The guard peered at them, unimpressed. "If you've come from the west, you've likely heard that Lord Royce's gates aren't open to every vagrant who wanders by. Show us your wares, if you're traders." Arya pursed her lips. They had no genuine wares to show. "We have coin," she tried, "and a few furs." She glanced at Sandor's saddlebag, where a couple of old pelts from their hunts were stuffed. But she suspected it wouldn't be enough to convince them. She forced herself to think quickly. We've heard rumor that Lord Royce pays well for certain items. We've knowledge of some fighting in the hills, bandits and such. We can share what we know, if your lord is willing to pay. The guard's skeptical gaze flickered to Sandor, who remained silent, hooded. Bandit reports are a copper a dozen these days, he said. What makes yours worth the trouble? Arya grimaced. The direct approach was failing. We need lodging, she said, trying a different tack. If we can't enter the settlement, can we at least wait out the storm in a stable? We can pay. The guard seemed to consider, glancing at his fellow. The second guard shrugged as if to say, they don't look dangerous. After a moment, the first guard nodded curtly. All right, but keep your heads down. If you cause trouble, you'll wish you hadn't. The stable's near the gate, on the left. He waved them forward, stepping aside. The wooden gate was hoisted open a fraction, enough to let them pass. Cold rain slashed across Arya's cheeks, and she felt a surge of nervous energy. They were inside Runestone's outer settlement, but that was the easy part. Ahead, muddy lanes twisted between wooden houses. At the far end, a raised stone causeway led up to the fortress proper. More guards patrolled there. Getting inside those walls would be far more difficult. They found the stable easily enough. A small, sturdy building where a balding stablemaster glowered at the unexpected arrivals. With some coaxing and a few silvers from Arya, he agreed to shelter their horses and allow them space in the loft, though he watched them like a hawk. The interior was warmer than the outside air, at least. Sheltered from the rain, they took off their cloaks and tried to decide their next move. Arya brushed water from her hair. We could try to slip in as servants or workers. If they're busy with patrols and scouting for bandits, they might not notice two more hired hands. Sandor leaned against a post, arms crossed, water still dripping from the ends of his hair. That might work for you, but I stand out like a damned mountain. And if they see my face, it's over. She frowned. True. Glancing around, she lowered her voice even more. What if we contact Lord Royce directly? Send him a note? We could claim it's urgent intelligence, but it must be delivered to him alone. Then we sign it, Arya Stark. Sandor studied her, a doubtful flicker in his eyes. He might dismiss it as a fake. There've been rumors of fake Aryas before, and if he doesn't dismiss it, he might lock the gate and lay a trap to see if you come forward. You'd be walking in blind. Arya pressed her lips together. The sound of pouring rain on the stable roof filled her ears. We might not have any other option, she said softly. If we keep creeping around the edges, we'll never get an audience. She recalled how the Freys had used a fake Arya to secure the north, and how the Boltons in other tales might have done the same. But Yohn Royce was not the Freys or the Boltons or even Baelish. He had a reputation for an old-fashioned sense of honor. That was all she had to cling to. She paced in the straw, ignoring the stablemaster's curious glance from across the way. Let's at least try to find out more about the day-to-day workings of the castle. Who goes in and out, who might carry a message for us. Maybe there's a scribe or a steward who handles correspondence. Sandor didn't look pleased, but he gave a grunt of assent. We'll ask around, carefully. One slip, and we'll have the entire garrison on us. Then let's go, Arya decided. She flicked her cloak back on, though it was still damp, and tugged the hood low. Keep your hood up. Outside, the rain pelted down with unrelenting force. The muddy lanes were nearly empty. A few fishermen huddled under awnings, tending nets. Some housewives scurried between doorways. The clang of a blacksmith's hammer echoed from somewhere deeper within the settlement. Arya and Sandor moved along, trying to look like travelers in search of a meal or a place to rest. Occasionally, they stopped by small shops or open sheds, scanning the wares. Sparse produce, fish, meager grain. Runestone's village showed signs of the times. Wariness, shortage, a reluctance to greet strangers. Eventually, they reached a small covered stand near the foot of the causeway. A man with a drooping mustache stood behind it, displaying a few lumps of coal and broken bits of iron. He He seemed bored. Arya saw an opportunity. She leaned close to him, raising her voice over the rain. "Any chance you can tell us who to speak to about carrying a message to Lord Royce?" she asked. "We've important news from the hills, but the guards won't let us through." The man eyed her suspiciously. "Why should I help you?" Arya risked a small bribe, sliding a copper across the rough wood. "We need someone discreet," she said in a low tone. "We think Lord Royce will want to hear what we know." The man looked down at the coin, then at her, then at Sandor's looming shape. He snatched the copper, pocketing it quickly. "There's a steward named Hilmer in the outer ward. He handles messages for the Lord. If you can get inside the outer ward gates, you'll find him in the second building to the left. Big wooden door with iron studs. But he won't meet with just anyone. You'd need a guard's recommendation, or the steward's scribe might show you the door." Arya nodded, letting the man's words sink in. "Thank you." He shrugged, flicking his gaze between them. "If you get in trouble, don't bring my name into it," he muttered. Arya and Sandor retreated into the rain, stepping away from the stand. She exhaled, pushing wet strands of hair from her forehead. "We need a guard's recommendation, or we bluff our way past. Or maybe we find another approach." Sandor scanned the causeway that led up to the fortress. 2 guards stood at the gatehouse, half sheltered by an overhang, bored but watchful. Beyond, the outer ward's walls loomed. "We could watch for a merchant or official who has permission to enter," he said. "Try to slip in with them, or talk them into carrying a message." Arya remembered how she had once disguised herself to escape King's Landing, then later with the Brotherhood, and so many other times. "Or we could try to pass as servants." Her mind flicked through possibilities. "But one look at you, and they'll know you don't belong." She stifled a half-laugh. "Unless you want to pretend to be a mute sellsword." He scowled. "I'd prefer not to talk at all if it helps. But they'll want to see my face eventually, won't they?" A surge of frustration rippled through Arya. She turned away from the gate and glanced around the settlement, scanning the muddy lanes. She spotted a small stone building with a sign that read taproom, barely legible in the rain. "We could go in there," she suggested. "Maybe among the drunkards, we'll find someone who can be bought." Sandor shrugged. "Better than standing in the rain." They made their way to the taproom, pushing open the wooden door into a cramped space with a rough bar and a few tables. The scent of stale ale and damp clothing met them. A single lantern sputtered overhead. 2 men in the corner nursed drinks. A third dozed with his head on the table. The barkeep, a barrel-chested fellow with thinning hair, glanced up. "Weather's a curse, isn't it?" he said by way of greeting. Arya approached, feigning a casual air. She paid for a mug of weak ale, one for the Hound as well, though she knew he might not drink it. They took a seat at a small table near the back, removing their cloaks but keeping hoods half-drawn. The barkeep returned to wiping mugs, humming softly. Outside, the rain continued in a steady downpour. Arya sipped the ale, watery, but at least it was wet. She eyed the men in the corner, trying to decide if any might be connected to the castle. They wore rough clothes, didn't look like knights or men-at-arms. One had a battered nose and a lazy eye, the other was gaunt and unshaven. She guessed them to be local fishermen or laborers, men who drowned their troubles in cheap drink. Finally, she leaned toward Sandor. "I'll ask the barkeep," she whispered. "He might know someone who can get a message through." Sandor gave a slight nod. She stood, approached the bar, and waited until the barkeep acknowledged her. "Another mug?" he offered. "No," she said, leaning in so the men in the corner wouldn't hear. "I'm looking for a way to get a message to the steward in the castle. Hilmer, I believe. It's important. I can pay for the trouble." The barkeep raised an eyebrow, curiosity piqued. "Might I ask why you want to see him?" "The steward's a busy man." Arya managed a small shrug. "We bring news of bandits, potential threats to the Lord's domain. We don't want to cause a stir, but we believe he should know." She hoped her half-truth would suffice. The barkeep considered, wiping a trickle of ale from the counter. Hilmer is particular about who he meets, but sometimes travelers come to deliver news from the western passes. He has a clerk who screens them in the outer ward offices. That's how it's done, official-like. Arya frowned. So we'd have to get into the outer ward, talk to his clerk, then maybe Hilmer sees us? He nodded. That's the process. She let out a quiet breath, then glanced at the door. Any idea how we might get inside without the guards turning us away? We're just travelers, not official messengers. The barkeep hesitated, eyeing her with a touch of suspicion. Folk here don't usually knows about the castle unless they have good reason. Are you sure it's wise? We have good reason, Arya said firmly, letting a hint of steel show in her gaze. Then she softened her tone. Look, I'm not trying to cause trouble, but if there's a guard captain or someone who handles new arrivals, we could talk to them. We'd like to do this properly. The barkeep tapped his fingers on the counter, then leaned closer. All right, Captain Garen's in charge of the gate watch for the fortress. He often comes here in the evenings for a drink, or sometimes he drops by the fishmonger's next door. If you catch him, you might persuade him to let you in, if your coin is good or your story's convincing. Arya's lips curled in a faint smile. Thank you. That's helpful. She placed a silver piece on the bar. The barkeep pocketed it quickly, nodding in appreciation. We'll wait, she said. She returned to the table, relaying what she'd learned to Sandor. He slouched against the wall, swirling the ale in his mug. So we wait for this captain to show up, try to bribe him or talk him into letting us inside to see the steward? Arya nodded. Yes, and if that fails, we'll find another way. She paused, lifting her mug to her lips. We should be ready for violence if it goes wrong. He snorted. Always. And so they waited. The hours crept by. The men in the corner left eventually, replaced by a pair of fishermen who shook off their cloaks and ordered weak ale. Outside, the rain lessened to a drizzle, then picked up again in gusty squalls. Arya ate a small loaf the barkeep offered for a coin, splitting it with Sandor. Time dragged. She wondered if this Captain Garen would come at all tonight. As dusk approached, the door opened, and two men in dark Royce cloaks entered. One was broad-shouldered with a trimmed beard. The other was slighter, a boyish face under a wet hood. They nodded to the barkeep and took a seat near the hearth. The barkeep shot Arya a glance, then subtly inclined his head toward the broader man. She understood this must be Captain Garen. She caught Sandor's eye. He gave a barely perceptible nod and finished his mug in a gulp, rising to stand near the bar. Arya followed, mustering her courage. This was a delicate step. If Garen suspected they were criminals or had some reason to lock them up, the plan would unravel. They approached the captain's table. He eyed them warily. You want something? He asked, taking them in with a soldier's calculating gaze. Arya dipped her head in polite greeting. Captain Garen? We've been told you might help us speak to the steward at Runestone. We have urgent news and thought Lord Royce would want to hear it. His brow furrowed. Steward Hilmer sees 100 supplicants a week. What makes you special? And who are you? She swallowed. My name is Arya, from the hills. This is my father, Cedric. She gestured to the Hound, who kept his hood lowered. We had a run-in with bandits near the western passes. Nasty ones, apparently loyal to some outlaw leader who might be heading east. We thought to warn Lord Royce. The half-lie spilled out awkwardly, but she pressed on. We know he's concerned about outlaws, from what we've heard on the road. Captain Garen studied her face, then flicked his gaze to Sandor. You're a big man, he said. Don't see many hill folk with your build. You sure you're her father? Sandor gave a low grunt, pitching his voice rough and clipped. That's what I am, he said. You got a problem with that? His accent was more northern than Vale, but he made no effort to hide it. Garen raised a brow, then snorted. You watch your tone. You're the ones asking a favor. He looked back to Arya. This news of outlaws. Why bring it to the steward? Why not simply warn a guard tower or pass the message along to a soldier? Arya hesitated, thinking quickly. The bandits have a cunning leader. We heard they might try to strike a deal with certain unscrupulous merchants or lords. If that's true, then a simple guard might be in on it. We'd prefer to speak to someone with Lord Royce's ear to ensure the message is trusted." She tried to sound earnest. A long silence followed, the captain sizing them up. At last he shrugged. "Bandit raids are all too common these days, but I suppose Hilmer will want to hear specifics. Be at the castle gates tomorrow morning at dawn. Tell the guards I sent you. I'll let them know to expect 2 hill folk with news. They'll decide if you can speak to Hilmer." Relief fluttered in Arya's chest, but she kept her expression neutral. "Thank you, Captain Garin," she said softly. "We appreciate it." He waved a dismissive hand. "Don't thank me. If you're lying, I'll have your heads on spikes outside the walls." "Understood." Sandor inclined his head. "Understood." Garin scowled, then turned back to his companion, effectively dismissing them. Arya and Sandor retreated to their table, ignoring the prickle of tension at the back of her neck. They'd gained a foot in the door, but if the steward asked too many questions, or recognized them, things could turn lethal fast. They stayed a little while longer, sipping watered ale so as not to appear suspicious by leaving immediately. When the storm outside momentarily subsided, they slipped out, returning to the stable. The stablemaster was dozing in a corner, and the horses stirred as they entered. Arya climbed to the loft, Sandor behind her, and they settled in the straw again. "We have our chance," Arya whispered. "We'll get inside the outer ward tomorrow. Then we'll request a private audience. Maybe say we have intelligence that only the steward can hear." "And once we're alone with the steward?" Sandor asked in a low rumble. "What will you do? Tell him you're Arya Stark?" She exhaled, nerves fluttering. "Yes, I'll take off my hood, say my name, and ask him to bring me to Lord Royce. If he's loyal to the Vale, he should know the significance of a living Stark. I'll hope that's enough to keep him from calling the guards. Maybe he'll recognize my face from when I was a girl in Winterfell, or at least sense the truth. House Royce was friendly to the Starks once." Sandor raked a hand through his hair, tension radiating from him. "You're gambling on honor. I've seen how often that fails in this world." Arya's voice trembled slightly. "We have to try. If Lord Royce helps us, it could change everything. We could finally find Sansa. Maybe even rally some Vale lords against the Lannisters or Baelish. The North can't have all died for nothing." He watched her for a moment, expression unreadable in the dim lantern glow. Then he nodded slowly. "All right, girl. I'll follow your lead. But keep your wits about you." She lay back on the straw, exhaustion pulling at her. "I will," she murmured. The sweet edge of sleep tugged her down as rain resumed pattering on the roof. Tomorrow, they would step into the Keep of Runestone, risking everything on a fragile hope of honor and understanding. She wondered if Jon Royce was truly the man of principle rumors claimed him to be. And she couldn't help but remember how quickly men of principle had turned into men of betrayal when war and gold were on the scales. Morning arrived with heavy clouds and a cold wind off the sea. Arya and Sandor rose before dawn, quietly tending the horses. At first light, they walked up the muddy causeway toward the castle gates, hearts pounding with cautious anticipation. Captain Garin's men stood guard, and upon seeing Arya and Sandor, one waved them forward. Garin himself was not present, but he had apparently left word as promised. The gates creaked open, revealing a broad courtyard enclosed by thick stone walls. The fortress of Runestone had a dark majesty to it, the old stones scarred by centuries of weather and conflict. A few men-at-arms were drilling with spears near an inner gate, and a row of stables lined the courtyard's eastern edge. Standing in the drizzle, a short man in a heavy cloak beckoned them over. "You're the ones with news of bandits?" he asked in a clipped tone, looking them up and down. "Captain Garin said to expect you." Arya offered a slight bow of her head. "Yes, we need to see the steward, Hilmer. It's urgent." The short man narrowed his eyes. "The steward's got plenty to do. You'll share your news with me first, and I'll decide if it's worth his time." He gestured to a small antechamber near the outer wall, motioning for them to follow. Inside, the space was simple, bare stone walls, a single table, a flickering torch in a sconce. The short man shut the door, then turned, arms folded. "I'm Taurus, one of the steward's clerks. Now speak plainly." Arya hesitated. This was the moment. She could feed him the same bandit story, but that would only get them so far. She took a breath, feeling Sandor's presence at her back, steady and grim. "We do have news of outlaws," she began carefully. "But that's not the only reason we came. My name isn't Arya. It's Arya Stark of Winterfell." Taurus's eyes widened in disbelief. "Arya Stark? The lords believed you dead, or the rumors?" He trailed off, scanning her face. She pushed back her hood, letting her wet hair fall to her shoulders, the shape of her features visible. His mouth opened, then closed. "This is a dangerous claim. You're sure you want to speak it here?" "Yes," Arya said firmly. "I am Ned Stark's daughter. I've come to request Lord Royce's help." "You see." Before she could finish, Taurus raised a hand, cutting her off. "If you're truly who you say, the steward must hear it. This is beyond my station." His face was a mixture of shock and concern. "Are you alone? Who is this man?" Arya glanced at Sandor. He said nothing, letting his hood remain up, his posture coiled. "A companion," she said simply. "He's helped me survive." Taurus swallowed hard. "Wait here," he said, voice shaky. "I'll fetch the steward. Don't move from this room." He slid out the door, shutting it behind him. Arya let out a shaky breath. The first hurdle was passed. Taurus hadn't called for guards to throw them in irons. Sandor shifted. "He believes you?" he asked in a low murmur. "Maybe. Or maybe he's gone to summon the entire guard. We'll know soon enough." She tried to steady her racing heart. Time seemed to stretch in the cramped antechamber. The torches flicker, the only sign that the world still moved. Rain tapped on the roof overhead. Arya fought the urge to pace. Finally, the door swung open, and Taurus returned, accompanied by a taller man with gray-streaked hair and a sharp, serious face. He wore a sober robe belted at the waist, the ring of keys and a ledger under his arm marking him as a man of administration. Hilmer, the steward of Runestone. Hilmer's eyes honed in on Arya with a penetrating intensity. He closed the door behind him, leaving Taurus in the corridor. Approaching slowly, he studied her features. "You claim to be Arya Stark?" he said quietly, voice carrying a certain authority. "I served here during Lord Jon Arryn's time. I visited Winterfell once, many years ago. I saw Lord Eddard and his children briefly. The younger daughter was, perhaps of 8 or 9. Arya's pulse quickened. "I'm older now," she said, forcing a small, bitter smile. "The world has changed me, but yes, I'm that girl. I survived Harrenhal, the War of the Five Kings, the Red Wedding, all of it. And now I've come to the Vale seeking my sister, Sansa, who I believe might be under Lord Baelish's control at the Eyrie." Hilmer's lined face revealed flickers of astonishment, confusion, and guarded sympathy. "We've heard rumors that Lady Sansa Stark wed Tyrion Lannister, but then vanished from King's Landing. Others say she's with Lord Baelish at the Eyrie, but I know not the truth. Lord Royce has suspected Baelish of concealing her for some time." Arya clenched her fists. "I need to see Lord Royce, to ask for his help and protection. I'm tired of hiding on the roads. If your lord is the honorable man I believe him to be, he'll help me and my companion achieve an audience with my sister, or at least confirm she's safe." Hilmer exhaled slowly, the gravity of the situation stark in his posture. "Lord Royce is indeed a man of honor, my lady, but you must understand the implications. Peter Baelish is officially the protector of the Vale, controlling the boy Lord Robin Arryn. If Lord Royce shelters a Stark who opposes Baelish's guardianship, it could spark open conflict." Arya's eyes hardened. "I'm not here to cause strife, but I won't hide the truth anymore. Baelish was allied with the Lannisters. My father died. My mother died. Robb died. I have no illusions about what that means. If Lord Royce can help, I'll be in his debt." Hilmer studied her a moment longer, then glanced at Sandor. "And this man? Who is he?" Sandor lifted his chin, letting the hood slip back enough to reveal the scarring around his eye. Hilmer's face tightened as recognition flashed across it. "Sandor Clegane," he breathed, voice taut. "They call you the Hound, once sworn to House Lannister." The Hound's mouth twisted in an unreadable expression. "I'm sworn to no one," he said flatly. Hilmer cast a wary look at Arya. "He was said to be a dangerous man. Are you certain you trust him, my lady?" Arya's voice came out colder than she intended. "He saved my life more than once. That's all you need to know. If you arrest him, you may as well arrest me too." She felt the tension in the air, Hilmer's caution pressing against her. But she refused to waver. The steward slowly nodded, though wariness still danced in his gaze. "Very well. I will arrange a private meeting with Lord Royce. He must see and judge for himself. Until then, I ask that you remain here in the castle, discreetly. I'll have rooms prepared in the West Tower, under watch but comfortable enough. This cannot become public knowledge yet." Arya's heart pounded with relief and apprehension all at once. "Thank you. I'll accept your conditions, as long as I can speak to Lord Royce soon." Hilmer nodded again, ushering them out of the antechamber and into a side corridor that led deeper into the fortress. He signaled for a pair of guards, instructing them quietly to guide the visitors to the West Tower chambers. The guards, serious-faced men in Royce livery, flanked Arya and Sandor. Arya felt the stirrings of tension in her gut. Escorted, watched. They were not exactly prisoners, but they were far from free. They crossed a courtyard paved with slick stones, then entered another wing of the fortress. Hallways of old gray rock stretched away, torchlit but damp. Servants scurried about, some pausing to glance at the newcomers. A few whispered to each other, curiosity evident. Arya could only imagine the rumors that would spread by nightfall. 2 mysterious travelers escorted by the steward's guards. She hoped none recognized Sandor's face, or else half the fortress might soon be abuzz with talk of the Hound. Eventually, they reached a spiraling staircase in a square tower. The guards led them up several flights, past arrow slits revealing glimpses of the sea beyond. Finally, they arrived at a small landing with a stout wooden door. One guard produced a key and unlocked it, motioning Arya and Sandor inside. The interior was modest. A fireplace, a couple of chairs, a small table, and a narrow bed with a straw mattress. A second, smaller room adjoined, presumably another bedchamber. "You'll stay here," said the guard. "We'll bring food and water. The steward will send for you when Lord Royce is ready." His voice was neutral, but the implication was clear. Do not attempt to leave on your own. Sandor folded his arms. "And if we need to use the privy?" The guard pointed down the landing. "Knock and inform us. We'll escort you. Don't wander." With that, the guards withdrew, locking the door behind them. A heavy scrape of metal indicated a bar sliding into place. Arya stood in the center of the room, letting out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "At least we're inside," she said, forcing a small smirk. "And they haven't thrown us in a dungeon." Sandor paced, scowling at the locked door. "Might as well be. We're locked up." She shrugged, stepping over to the small window. The glass was crude, set in lead, offering a distorted view of the courtyard below, but with a bed and presumably some food coming. Better than a muddy ditch. He grunted, not entirely pleased but unable to argue the point. After a moment, he sank into one of the chairs, grimacing at the tight fit for his large frame. Arya glanced around, noticing a jug on the table empty and a narrow fireplace with no fire yet lit. She was cold, but at least they were out of the rain. "What do we do now?" Sandor asked, his voice low. "Wait." Arya nodded, resting a hand on the window's rough sill. "We wait for Lord Royce to summon us. When he does, I'll speak my truth. We'll see if he believes me, see if he's willing to stand against Baelish if it comes to that." She turned toward him, meeting his eyes. "I hope this is the right choice." Sandor watched her for a long beat, If it's not, we'll fight our way out. We've done it before. A flicker of dark humor tugged at her lips. We have. Then she sank onto the bed, the straw rustling beneath her weight. She felt the weight of the moment pressing on her. So much hung on Lord Royce's reaction. Her hopes of finding Sansa, of forging an alliance, of escaping a fugitive's life on the roads. Yet fear gripped her, too. She remembered the Red Wedding, the betrayal at King's Landing, how quickly alliances could shift. One false move and everything could be lost. Hours passed with excruciating slowness. A servant appeared to bring them a tray of bread, cheese, and watered wine, then hurried away, locking the door again behind him. The Hound ate in silence, methodically chewing. Arya forced herself to eat as well, though her nerves twisted her stomach. Night fell, the storm's wind howling around the tower. A guard came in with extra blankets and lit the fireplace at Arya's request, though he said nothing more. By the time the chamber warmed, it was late. Arya drifted to the window, gazing down at the courtyard torches flickering below. She wondered if somewhere in these walls, Lord Yohn Royce debated her fate, or if he even knew she was here yet. She conjured his face from memory, an imposing man in dark bronze armor, known for his proud, traditional ways. Eventually, exhaustion tugged at her, and she surrendered to the bed. The Hound took the smaller adjoining room, likely to sprawl on the straw mattress there. Sleep came fitfully to Arya, filled with restless dreams. Faces from her list, the ghosts of those she'd lost, the image of Sansa's red hair drifting away into darkness. She woke before dawn, the sky barely lightening beyond the tiny window. The fortress was quiet, except for distant footsteps echoing in the stairwell. Sandor was already awake, sitting by the fireplace's embers, fiddling with the straps of his gauntlets. He looked up as she stirred. "No one's come," he said, voice hushed. Just then, a loud rapping sounded on the door. Both Arya and Sandor tensed, hands moving unconsciously toward their weapons. But they'd placed their swords near the bedside. The door unlocked with a clank, and a guard stepped in, followed by Hilmer the steward, wearing the same somber expression as before. "Good morning," Hilmer said, eyes flicking between them. "Lord Royce is prepared to see you now, but he insists on discretion. You'll be taken to a private audience in the Great Hall, with only a handful of trusted men present." His voice held a note of caution. "Come with me." Arya nodded, heart pounding. She snatched up Needle from where it lay by the bed, then hesitated, uncertain if they'd force her to surrender her steel. Hilmer noticed and inclined his head. "Carry your blades if you wish, but do not draw them unless you want to die in a hail of arrows. Lord Royce's men will be watching." Sandor buckled his sword belt, maintaining silence. Arya swallowed hard and followed Hilmer and the guards out the door, down the spiral stairs. The winding corridors seemed narrower now, each step thrumming with the tension of what lay ahead. At last, they emerged into a corridor that opened onto the Great Hall. A vaulted chamber of stone pillars, lit by tall windows on one side and torch sconces on the other. The hall was not as grand as Winterfell's or the Red Keep's, but it had a severe elegance, ancient tapestries and bronze ornaments glinting with the Royce sigil. At the far end, on a simple dais, stood Lord Yohn Royce himself. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with streaks of gray at his temples and a stern but not unkind face. He wore a well-fitted doublet of dark cloth with bronze fastenings shaped like runes. At his side stood two knights in armor, swords sheathed at their hips, and an older woman in a plain gown, perhaps a lady of the household. A few guards ringed the hall, watchful and armed. The place smelled of cold stone and old polish, as though 1,000 years of pride and dust had mingled here. Arya forced herself to walk forward, step by step, Sandor at her side. Hilmer approached the dais first, bowing deeply. "My lord, these are the visitors, the girl who claims to be Arya Stark, and her companion, Sandor Clegane." A murmur rippled through those assembled, and Arya caught a flicker of alarm on the older woman's face. Lord Royce, however, remained stoic. His gaze swept over Arya, then the Hound. "I see," he said in a deep baritone. So the rumors are true. The Hound still lives. Sandor gave the slightest inclination of his head, saying nothing. Lord Royce's eyes returned to Arya. He studied her face, the clothes worn from travel, the sword at her hip. His brow furrowed. "You claim you are Arya Stark?" She lifted her chin. "I do, my lord. I was the youngest daughter of Lord Eddard. I escaped the Lannisters and the Freys. I've wandered for years, searching for what remains of my family." Royce's mouth pressed into a grim line. "Forgive my suspicion, but there have been false Starks before. Why should I believe you? What proof can you offer?" Arya's mind raced. She had anticipated this question. "In Winterfell, I learned to shoot a bow from my half-brother Jon Snow. My father gave me a small bow of yew sized for a child. I once shot an arrow into the courtyard where my sister Sansa was practicing her sewing, causing her to prick her finger. She was furious," she said, voice trembling with the memory. "I recall Lord Vayon Poole, who served as our steward, scolding me for my tomboy ways. I recall how your own house, House Royce, sent men to help guard the roads for King Robert's visit, wearing bronze runes on their cloaks. My father explained to me the significance of your ancient bronze traditions, how you favored old runic designs." She paused, voice steadying. "I was no lady of the court. I wanted to be a knight. My father once caught me with a sword I'd stolen from the armory. He made me return it, but later arranged for me to be trained in secret by a Braavosi water dancer, Syrio Farrell." Royce's expression softened slightly, as if the specificity of her recollections tugged at some place of empathy or recognition. Ned Stark's younger daughter was indeed known for her boldness. "But I must ask, why is Sandor Clegane with you? He once served Joffrey, the boy king who had your father executed." Arya exhaled. "We've both lost faith in the Lannisters. We've both faced death and betrayal. In the end, he helped me survive when the world offered no mercy. I won't say we're friends exactly, but he is my companion." Royce shot a sharp glance at the Hound. "Is that true, Clegane? Have you turned your back on the Lannisters?" Sandor met his gaze without flinching. "They never deserved my loyalty. I'm no friend of the Lions." His lip curled. "I'm tired of kings and lords, but I travel with the girl because, well, she's got more guts than most of them. That's the short of it." A tense silence gripped the hall. Royce looked to one of the knights at his side, a tall, lanky man with a patchy beard, who shrugged uncertainly. Then the older woman stepped forward, her hands clasped. "My lord, if this is truly Arya Stark, we must treat her with respect due to a daughter of House Stark." The Vale was always close to House Arryn, but also had ties of friendship with the North. Lord Eddard was a friend to Jon Arryn, was he not? Royce nodded slowly. "He was." Then he addressed Arya again. "You say you seek your sister, Sansa? Rumors abound that she's in the Eyrie, under Peter Baelish's guardianship. I cannot confirm or deny that rumor. Lord Baelish keeps his affairs cloaked in secrecy." Arya's lips tightened. "If she's truly there, can you help me reach her? Baelish was complicit in my father's downfall. I don't trust him with Sansa. Please, my lord, if you have any sense of loyalty to the memory of Lord Eddard, help me find my sister." Royce let out a heavy breath. "We are in a precarious situation. Lord Baelish has effectively ruled the Vale since Lady Lysa's demise, guiding young Lord Robin in all matters. Many lords resent Baelish, myself among them, yet he remains the official protector. If we openly defy him, it might fracture the Vale into civil strife. But if we do nothing, we stand idle while a Stark girl might be held in manipulation or captivity." Arya felt hope mingled with fear. "So you believe me? You'll help?" He studied her a moment longer, then nodded once. "I believe you are who you say. I see Ned Stark in your eyes, and your knowledge aligns with what little I recall of your youth. I will not turn you away." A murmur ran through the knights present. Royce lifted a hand. "But how we proceed requires utmost care. We must confirm the status of your sister. If Baelish has her at the Eyrie, I'll need some pretense to gain access or to summon her without arousing his suspicions. Arya's relief was profound. She almost wobbled where she stood. "Thank you, my lord. I'm grateful." Royce waved off her thanks. "Hilmer will see that you're given quarters more suitable for your station. But you must remain discreet. We cannot let word spread that Arya Stark is in the Vale, at least not yet. Baelish has many eyes. He might move against you, or take your sister elsewhere if he senses a threat." Sandor shifted, arms folded. "What if Baelish tries to kill the girl once he finds out she's alive? That's his style, working from the shadows." Royce nodded grimly. "That is our concern. We must move carefully. Allow me a day or two to consult with a few trusted allies here. We'll plan how best to approach the Eyrie. For now, you are under my protection." A weight lifted from Arya's chest, replaced by a sense of vulnerability. She was no longer on the roads, fending for herself, but being under someone's roof, someone's protection, meant placing her fate in their hands. In the past, that had led to captivity or betrayal, but she had to trust someone. Royce stepped down from the dais, surprising her with how tall he was. He approached, putting a hand on her shoulder gently. "You've endured much, child. House Royce remembers Ned Stark's honor. I'll do what I can." She blinked back a surge of emotion, nodding. "Thank you, my lord." He regarded Sandor next, more coolly. "Clegane, I'll allow you to remain here alongside her, for the time being. But I warn you, any violence within these walls, and I'll have you cut down." "Understood." Sandor inclined his head. "I'm not here to start trouble." Royce allowed himself a grim half-smile. "Then we're in agreement." He turned to the steward. "Hilmer, see to their quarters. Let them rest and recover from their travels. Set a guard, but instruct them to treat Lady Arya with courtesy. I'll speak with her again soon." "Of course, my lord," Hilmer said, bowing. With that, the audience ended. Royce dismissed the knights and turned away, conferring quietly with the older woman who might have been his sister or a senior lady of the castle. Arya let out a quiet breath, stepping back. Hilmer gently guided her and Sandor from the hall, out a side door, down another corridor that led toward a different tower. The castle seemed a labyrinth of stone passages, narrow windows, ancient tapestries. Along the way, Arya felt the stares of passing guards, who likely wondered what business the steward had with such ragged newcomers. But no one challenged them. At last, Hilmer halted outside a wooden door with iron bands. He lifted a ring of keys from his belt, opened it, and motioned them in. The chamber within was larger than the one they'd been given before. A fireplace stood ready with stacked logs, a small table with chairs, and 2 bedchambers branched off from the main room. A window overlooked the sea. Arya glimpsed the gray expanse through the rain-smeared glass, waves churning along rocky shores below. "Please, consider these rooms yours for the moment," Hilmer said. "I'll post a guard outside to ensure your safety and, well, to ensure no one unauthorized comes calling. If you need anything, speak with the guard, and I'll see it provided." Arya stepped inside, letting the tension ease from her shoulders. Sandor followed, scanning the area with a practiced eye, likely mapping exits and vantage points. Hilmer paused in the doorway. "Lord Royce is an honorable man, but he must weigh many factors. Rest assured he will do everything he can to help you, and to shield you from Baelish's influence. For now, that may mean waiting a bit." Arya nodded. "We understand. Thank you." With a polite bow, Hilmer withdrew, closing the door. A guard's footsteps sounded as he took station outside, the faint clink of steel audible. Arya looked around at the modest comfort of the chamber. Tapestries of runic designs, a plush chair by the fireplace, a simple but clean bed. It felt almost decadent compared to the stable lofts and roadside huts she'd grown used to. Sandor removed his sword belt and set it near the table, then ran a hand through his hair. "Well," he muttered, "we're here. You're under a lord's protection. The question is, what next?" Arya turned to the window, gazing at the storm-lashed sea. She recalled how she'd once daydreamed about sailing across the narrow sea, seeking bravos or adventure. Now, The swirling waves only reminded her how turbulent her life remained. We wait. We see if Royce can devise a plan to reach Sansa. If Baelish is truly controlling her, we'll have to free her somehow. Maybe we can travel to the Eyrie under the pretense of official business. I don't know. Sandor snorted. I doubt Baelish will simply hand her over. Arya folded her arms. Brow knit. No, we may have to be cunning ourselves. But at least we're not alone anymore. House Royce might have the strength to stand up to Baelish if it comes to that. Sandor gave a short laugh without humor. We'll see. Men who talk of honor can still back down when they see the gold or the threat of the veil in chaos. Arya couldn't deny it. She moved to the fireplace, stacked some kindling, and struck a spark from a flint. Small flames caught, warming the air with a gentle crackle. You might be right, but we have to try. If we never trust anyone, we'll never find Sansa or reclaim anything for House Stark. She paused, feeding more wood into the nascent fire. Besides, if Lord Royce wanted us imprisoned or dead, we'd be in a cell right now. Sandor grunted agreement. He pulled off his damp boots, setting them near the warmth to dry. Arya did the same, and they lapsed into a tentative silence, each lost in the swirl of questions about the future. The hours slipped by. A servant brought a meal, fresh bread, salted fish, a stew of onions and carrots, and a pitcher of ale. It was more filling than anything Arya had eaten in ages. She devoured it with relish, feeling the comforting weight of real food in her belly. The Hound ate in his usual, methodical way, though she detected a flicker of relief on his face at not having to scrounge or kill for a meal. After they finished, Arya watched the rain batter the window, her thoughts drifting. She wondered where Sansa was at that very moment, if she was gazing out at a different storm from the heights of the Eyrie, lonely and frightened under Baelish's watch. Or maybe Sansa had found some measure of security, clueless that Arya still lived. The notion pained her, a sister out of reach. A soft knock sounded on the door. Sandor's hand went to his sword instinctively, but Arya called out, "Come in." The guard outside opened it a crack, letting Hilmer slip in. The steward's expression was thoughtful. He closed the door gently behind him. "My lady," he began, then glanced at Sandor, who hovered by the table. "Lord Royce has asked me to explain his intentions, in part. He'll send a raven to the Eyrie, requesting an audience with Lord Baelish and young Lord Robin on a matter of Vale security. If Baelish agrees, Lord Royce will ride there with a retinue. He plans to bring you in secret, perhaps disguised, to ascertain whether Lady Sansa is indeed present. If so, we can act accordingly." Arya rose from the chair, her pulse quickening. That's good news. But how will he keep me hidden? Baelish has eyes everywhere." Hilmer pressed his lips together. "We have ways to conceal a small party. Lord Royce will bring a contingent of men large enough to show respect and to discuss the realm's security, but not so large as to seem a threat. In the confusion, you might slip inside. It will be dangerous, but if we can confirm Lady Sansa's presence, your lordship, Lord Royce, will know how best to proceed." Arya sensed the steward's caution. "You still doubt me?" "No," Hilmer said quickly. "I don't doubt you. I caution you that Peter Baelish is cunning beyond measure. If he suspects you are here, he may spirit Lady Sansa away or do worse. We must not underestimate him. The Lord Protector's power in the Vale is unsteady, but his personal cunning is formidable." She swallowed, remembering how Baelish orchestrated so many tragedies, always stepping away clean. "I understand." Hilmer nodded. "Lord Royce will keep you informed as soon as he hears from the Eyrie. It may be a few days before the Raven returns. In the meantime, please remain within these walls. You are free to walk about the courtyard if you wish, but do not wander beyond. The guards have instructions to keep your presence discreet." Arya clenched her hands. "Thank you, Hilmer." She wanted to say more, to express her gratitude or the depth of her worry, but she found the words stuck. The steward bowed slightly and departed. When he was gone, Arya turned to Sandor. "So we wait again, but at least now there's a plan." He gave a shrug, leaning against the wall. "A plan that might get us both killed." But yes, better than rotting in the stable. Arya let out a breath. I'm used to risk. If there's a chance to save Sansa, I'll take it. Sandor just nodded, eyes glimmering with something like reluctant respect. We'll see it through, girl. The next few days passed in a strange, tense routine. Arya explored a bit of the fortress, strolling the inner courtyard where men-at-arms practiced archery or patrolled the walls. Guards accompanied her, always at a polite distance but never letting her slip away unobserved. She tried not to resent it. Lord Royce was simply protecting his position. Meanwhile, Sandor remained near their rooms much of the time, occasionally stepping out to pace the courtyard or check the stables. He drew stares wherever he went, rumors no doubt spreading among the castle folk of the tall, scarred stranger under Lord Royce's leave. Arya saw Lord Royce only once in passing. He crossed the courtyard with a group of knights, giving her a brief nod. She guessed he was busy preparing letters and making quiet maneuvers. She found it surreal to move around the fortress as if she were a guest of note, after so long spent in hiding. She ate in a side hall, not the main great hall, to keep her presence discreet. Servants were polite but curious, and she answered few questions, letting them assume she was a ward from another house. At night, she lay awake by the window, watching the storm-lashed sea and thinking of the road behind her, of the many close calls and blood-stained nights with the Hound. Part of her couldn't believe they'd come this far without all falling apart. Another part of her dreaded what lay ahead in the Eyrie, where Baelish lurked. On the fourth day, Hilmer came to her room with news. A raven had returned from the Eyrie. Lord Baelish agreed to meet Lord Royce, inviting him to visit and discuss the Vale's readiness for winter. Lord Robin was said to be unwell, perhaps lying abed, but would also grant an audience. Lord Royce planned to depart in 2 days' time. Arya's pulse raced with a mix of excitement and fear. She was close, so close, to finally seeing Sansa or learning her fate. She spent the remainder of those 2 days in subdued anticipation, going over every possible scenario in her mind. Sandor sharpened his sword and hers, muttering that if they needed to fight their way out, they'd best be ready. Arya wasn't sure if the fortress guards would stand with them or arrest them if swords were drawn against Baelish's men. Too many variables. They'd have to rely on guile, hoping that the presence of Lord Royce's men would keep Baelish from doing anything overt. At last, the morning of departure arrived. The rain had ceased overnight, leaving the sky overcast but calmer. Lord Royce assembled a retinue of 20 men, a modest force for a lord of his standing, but enough to show dignity. Arya and Sandor were told they'd ride near the rear, cloaked and hooded, blending in with the men-at-arms. Arya wore a borrowed cloak of thick wool-dyed brown, the hood large enough to shadow her face. Sandor had one in dark gray, his burn scars hidden. They took the horses Lord Royce provided, some of the fortress's spare mounts, as they'd stabled their own in the courtyard. Arya patted her mare's neck, feeling the animal's skittish energy. In the courtyard, Lord Royce mounted a tall destrier. He wore partial armor with bronze detailing, a sword at his side. He caught Arya's gaze and nodded solemnly, as if to reassure her. Then he raised a hand, signaling the men to form up. The drawbridge lowered over the fortress moat, and the small party trotted out. Outside, the settlement's folk stood aside, whispering at the passing of their lord's retinue. They rode for half a day along the coastal road. Arya kept her hood low, scanning the horizon. The sea glittered on their right, the stone hills rising on their left. Now and then, Lord Royce fell back to speak with her. The Eyrie is inland, he explained. We'll turn north soon, climbing the foothills. Baelish expects us in 2 days' time. We'll rest at an inn tonight, then press on in the morning. Arya only nodded. The tension in her chest never eased. She could almost feel Sansa's presence in the distance, separated by leagues of winding roads. Sandor rode beside her, silent, watchful. She glimpsed the glint of his sword hilt under the cloak. If violence came, she knew he'd kill to protect her or himself. That night, they halted at a small wayside inn, purchasing all the rooms for Lord Royce and his men. Arya ate a quiet supper, avoiding the curious stares of a few travelers who shared the common room. She slept in a cramped bed with a single candle lighting the gloom, waking often to the memory of unstoppable nightmares. Dawn broke chilly but clear. The retinue mounted again, winding north into the hills. By midday, they reached a crossroad that led east, deeper into the mountainous terrain. A sign read the Arya, with an arrow pointing along a steep track. The path grew narrower, twisting among rocky slopes and pine forests. Lord Royce's men traveled in pairs, alert for any sign of bandits or watchers. Arya wondered if Baelish had sent scouts. By late afternoon, the towering heights of the Ares mountain came into view, clouds hugging its sheer sides. The fabled giant's lance rose in the distance, its peak lost in the haze. The road led them to the gates of the Vale's seat. The approach was guarded by the gates of the moon, the lower fortress, from which a winding trail climbed to the Arya perched high above. Arya's heart hammered. She remembered traveling this path with the Hound once before, only to discover Aunt Lisa was dead and Sansa missing. At the gates of the moon, Baelish's men awaited them, 20 strong, wearing Arryn blue cloaks. Their captain, a lean man with a sharp gaze, greeted Lord Royce with stiff formality. "Welcome, my lord. Lord Protector Baelish awaits you within. He extends his hospitality." Arya shrank behind the line of Royce's men, hood drawn. She caught Sandor's eye. He gave a slight nod, indicating readiness. The combined party passed through the gates into the courtyard, a wide expanse of cobblestones surrounded by tall walls. Beyond rose the steep path that led to the Arya proper, clinging to the mountainside. The gates of the moon was smaller than the Arya, but still formidable in its own right. Lord Royce dismounted, greeted Baelish's captain with formal pleasantries. "We'll stable our horses here," he said. "Then ascend to the Arya as Lord Baelish instructs." The captain bowed. "Yes, my lord. My men will show you to your quarters. You'll rest here tonight, then ascend in the morning. The path is treacherous by night." Royce accepted, turning to his men. "Stable the horses. We'll lodge in the guest chambers." His gaze swept Arya's way, giving her the slightest nod of reassurance. Sandor and Arya followed the men into the stable yard, hearts pounding. They were that much closer to Baelish, to Sansa, if she was truly here. Danger crackled in the air like static. Arya's fingers tightened on Needle's hilt beneath her cloak. She prayed their infiltration would remain undiscovered long enough to find Sansa. Once she laid eyes on her sister, she'd figure out the next step. Escape, confrontation, or something else entirely. They bedded down the horses, then were directed to a row of rooms in a low stone building. The men bunked in pairs. Lord Royce insisted that Arya and Sandor share a small private room with a sturdy door, presumably for her safety. The walls felt too thin, the corridor too open. She could hear men's voices echoing, footsteps passing. Her nerves were stretched taut. That evening, Lord Royce was summoned to dine with Baelish in the main hall of the Gates of the Moon. Arya stayed behind as planned. The ruse was that the rest of Royce's men would remain in the guest quarters. From her window, Arya watched torchlight flicker across the courtyard. She wished she could see inside the hall, see Baelish's cunning face. The man was like a serpent in every rumor she'd ever heard. Was Sansa at dinner too, or hidden away at the Arya? Night deepened. Eventually, Royce returned, quietly knocking on Arya and Sandor's door. He slipped inside with a grave expression. "Baelish is alone," he said quietly, removing his cloak. "He claims Lady Sansa is at the Arya, watching over the ailing Lord Robin. He invited me to ascend tomorrow to pay respects to the boy. I suspect he's telling the truth about her presence. He knows I can't confirm the details unless I see her." Arya's breath quickened. "So tomorrow we go up?" "Yes," Royce replied. "I'll bring a few men, but Baelish insists it be a small party to avoid disturbing the boy. I've arranged for you to come with me, disguised as a squire. With your hood, it might suffice. Your companion, well, a large squire might raise suspicions. Perhaps he stays behind until we can quietly summon you once we're in. Baelish has fewer men at the Arya, so if we act quickly, we can speak to Lady Sansa privately." Arya's instinct was to protest leaving Sandor behind, but she understood the logic. Baelish would immediately notice a hulking figure. "All right," she said, heart thudding. "Let's do it." Sandor scowled. "I don't like the idea of you going alone." Royce raised a hand. "She'll have my protection, and a few of my loyal knights. If things go awry, we'll get her out. I promise you." Sandor's jaw clenched, but he didn't argue further. Arya could sense his frustration. If something went wrong, she'd be in the Viper's Den, reliant on Lord Royce's men. Still, it was their best chance to see Sansa face to face. They finalized the plan. At dawn, Arya would dress in a squire's garb, a simple tunic and breeches, and ride a mule up the path behind Lord Royce. A handful of Royce knights would accompany them. Once inside the Eyrie, they'd request an audience with Lord Robin. Likely, Baelish would stage manage the meeting. If Sansa appeared, Arya would reveal herself. If not, they'd demand to see her, citing House Royce's duty to confirm the welfare of the last known Stark. It was risky. If Baelish refused, what then? Arya hardly slept, pacing the small chamber. She could feel the Hound's gaze following her. Each time she paused, he'd open his mouth as if to say something, then fall silent. Finally, near midnight, he spoke softly. "You're braver than you look, girl, but be careful." She glanced at him, heart twisting with an odd mixture of gratitude and fear. "I will. We've come this far." Morning arrived with pale skies and a thin mist clinging to the mountains. The path up to the Eyrie was steep, zigzagging past stony ledges and narrow passes, with sheer drops that made Arya's head swim. She rode a small mule in the middle of Royce's group, wearing a plain squire's outfit, hair tucked under a floppy hat. Her face remained half-shadowed, but she could sense the keen gazes of Baelish's men who escorted them. She prayed they saw only a nondescript boy riding with the knights. As they climbed, the air grew thinner, colder. The wind bit at Arya's cheeks. She recalled traveling this path with the Hound, the terror of the drop below. Now, at least, the path was clear of snow, but the memories haunted her. At each switchback, she looked upward, seeing the Eyrie perched on the cliffside like a white eagle's nest. Towering above, the mountains soared into cloud. After hours of slow ascent, they reached the gates of the Eyrie. Pale stone walls soared, slender towers thrusting up like spears. Baelish's men at the gate let them in, exchanging polite words with Lord Royce. The courtyard was quiet, lined with pale tiles that gleamed in the weak sun. A single weirwood grew in one corner, its red leaves fluttering. Arya's nerves prickled. She dismounted with the knights. A tall steward in Arryn livery arrived, bowing to Royce. "Lord Baelish awaits you in the High Hall, my lord, along with Lord Robin." Royce nodded, handing his reins to a stable boy. Arya followed suit, trying to keep her face lowered. They passed into the castle's interior, ascending marble steps that led to the Eyrie corridors for which the Eyrie was famous. Windows opened onto dizzying drops, letting in chilly gusts. Her breath caught at the sight of the Vale far below, the clouds drifting like ghosts. She forced herself not to stare, focusing on the corridor ahead. At last, they emerged into the High Hall, a grand chamber with high, narrow windows overlooking the sky. Arya saw a dais with 2 chairs, one for the Lord Protector, one for the young Lord of the Eyrie. Baelish himself stood near the chairs, slender and smiling, dressed in rich velvet. He bowed slightly to Royce. Next to him, a pale, sickly boy, Lord Robin Arryn, slouched in his seat, blinking tiredly. Arya swept the chamber, searching for any sign of Sansa. She saw a few courtiers, a handful of guards, a maester. No tall, red-haired lady. Her heart pounded. Baelish's shrewd gaze flicked across the group, pausing on each face. She kept her head lowered, praying he wouldn't notice anything amiss. "Lord Royce," Baelish said in that smooth tone, "so good of you to come. Robin has been looking forward to your visit. Haven't you, my lord?" Robin coughed, glancing up. "Yes, I suppose. I'm tired, Peter." Baelish patted the boy's shoulder with a benevolent smile. "We won't tire you. Lord Royce wishes to ensure the Vale's defenses are all in order. Perhaps after we speak, you can return to your chambers." Lord Royce inclined his head. "Thank you, Lord Protector. My men and I appreciate your hospitality. We do, however, have a matter to address. House Royce has been concerned about the welfare of Lady Sansa Stark. Rumors say she's here." A faint flicker crossed Baelish's face, quickly replaced by polite neutrality. "Lady Sansa has indeed been a guest of the Arya. However, she is indisposed at the moment, assisting with matters in the sewing chamber. I'm sure you needn't trouble her, unless there's urgent cause." Lord Royce's jaw set. "I believe there is. The Vale's lords have an interest in ensuring the safety of the Stark line, given our historical friendship with House Stark. With winter coming, unity among our houses is paramount." Baelish spread his hands. "Of course, but Lady Sansa's presence here is a delicate matter. She was wed to Tyrion Lannister, then fled King's Landing. The realm sees her as a fugitive. If the lords of the Vale openly shelter her, it could provoke the Iron Throne's wrath. For now, it's safer if her whereabouts remain discreet." Royce's gaze hardened. "I understand the caution, but I must speak with her myself to confirm her identity and condition. Her father was a good friend to the Vale." A hint of steel glinted in Baelish's eyes. "Lord Yone, I assure you Lady Sansa is well cared for. She has all the comfort we can provide, and Lord Robin dotes on his cousin. Do you not?" He nudged the boy, who mumbled something incoherent. Lord Royce pressed on. "I insist on seeing her, Lord Baelish. If the Vale is to stand strong, we need transparency, especially where the last known Stark is concerned." Baelish's smile tightened. "I see. Very well, if it will ease your mind. She can appear briefly, though I fear the excitement may distress her." He gestured to a guard. "Fetch Lady Sansa, if she's feeling well enough." Arya's heart hammered. So close, she dared not raise her head, for fear of Baelish's sharp eyes. She felt the tension in the hall thicken, the hush of courtiers who sensed something unusual. Moments stretched like hours. Then, at the far side, a door opened. A slender figure in a pale gown stepped in, flanked by two ladies. Her hair, a dark auburn, was braided elegantly. She carried herself with a subdued grace, her eyes downcast at first, then lifting. "Sansa." Arya's breath caught in her throat at the sight of her sister. Alive, older, her face lined with sorrow or worry. She wore the courtesy of a lady, but Arya recognized the gentle slope of her cheeks, the softness of her gaze. She was different from the girl who once dreamed of songs and nights. This Sansa had shadows beneath her eyes, as though the world had weighed heavily on her shoulders. Arya yearned to cry out her name, to run to her, but she forced herself still. Sansa approached the dais, curtsying gracefully. "My lord," she said, addressing Robin, who gazed blankly. Then she offered a respectful nod to Lord Royce. "Welcome." Royce studied her face, then inclined his head. "My lady, you appear well. Forgive me for insisting upon this meeting. The Vale's lords are concerned, given the many tragedies befallen your house. We simply wished to confirm you were safe." She managed a small, polite smile. "You are kind, Lord Royce. I am, as well as can be expected, thanks to my cousin Robin and Lord Baelish." Baelish stepped forward, placing a hand on Sansa's shoulder in a gesture of protective closeness that made Arya's stomach churn. "You see," he said lightly, "Lady Sansa has everything she needs here, though I appreciate your concern, Lord Yone." Arya's hands trembled under her cloak. She waited for the signal from Royce, for the moment to reveal herself. Royce hesitated, scanning the hall. "Yes, I see," he said, "but there is a question that remains. House Royce has reason to believe another member of House Stark yet lives." Sansa's eyes flickered with confusion. "Another Stark?" Royce nodded. "Yes, your sister, Arya." At the sound of her name, Sansa's breath caught, her eyes widening. Baelish's grip on her shoulder tightened, but he kept his face neutral. Arya Stark was rumored dead or missing. My lady is surely aware how improbable it would be for her to have survived the horrors of the war. Sansa's cheeks paled, emotions flitting across her features. Yes, I believed her dead. Or lost. There were so many rumors. Lord Royce cleared his throat. Yet here we stand. Would you be glad if Arya lived, Lady Sansa? Tears gleamed in Sansa's eyes, her composure wavering. Of course, Arya is my sister. If she lived, I would rejoice. Baelish squeezed her shoulder, his expression cautious. Royce glanced back toward where Arya stood among the knights. He gave her the slightest nod. Arya's heart lurched. This was it, her moment. Before Baelish could protest, she stepped forward, pushing back her hood. A hush fell over the hall as a young, brown-haired girl was revealed. Her face lined with the hardness of survival, but undeniably of Stark blood. Arya? Sansa whispered, her voice catching. She took a half-step forward, her eyes brimming with shock and an anguished joy. Arya, is it really you? Arya forced out the words past the lump in her throat. It's me, Sansa. I'm alive. I've been searching for you. A gasp rippled through the onlookers. Baelish's face went still, his eyes darting from Arya to Royce to Sansa. Robin blinked, confusion scrawled across his childlike features. Sansa let out a sob, pulling away from Baelish to rush toward Arya. The knights parted, letting her through. Arya met her in the center of the hall, and for a moment, they simply stared at each other. Two sisters separated by war and betrayal and years of suffering. Then, hesitantly, they embraced. Arya felt Sansa's arms around her, trembling with emotion. She closed her eyes, inhaling the faint scent of her sister's hair, remembering a time long ago when their biggest quarrels were about sewing needles and ribbons. Sansa, Arya murmured, her voice breaking. I thought I'd lost you too. Sansa clung to her, tears falling. I'm sorry for everything. I never thought. She couldn't finish. Arya felt the wave of shared grief wash over them. Of Ned, Catelyn, Robb, everything stolen away. A pointed cough shattered the moment. Baelish's voice, taut and carefully controlled. This is quite the surprise. Arya Stark, miraculously alive. May we inquire how you found your way here with Lord Royce? Arya pulled away from Sansa, turning to meet Baelish's calculating stare. I traveled many roads, Lord Baelish. I was helped by those loyal to my father's memory, men who recognized the injustice done to House Stark. Lord Royce welcomed me under his protection. Baelish's lips curved in a tight smile. How remarkable, and so very timely. Of course, I'm delighted for Lady Sansa to be reunited with her sister. Still, we must be mindful of the realm's reaction. Another Stark returning from the grave. Well, it might attract unwanted attention. Lord Royce stepped in, his voice firm. I believe the Vale should openly shelter both Stark girls if that's their wish. Lord Eddard was an ally to Jon Arryn. We do him honor by safeguarding his children. Baelish's eyes flicked to Sansa, who still stood beside Arya, tears on her cheeks but a growing resolve in her gaze. Of course, Baelish repeated, though his tone carried caution. We must do what's best for them, and for the Vale. Sansa looked at Baelish, then back to Arya. She spoke softly, but with steel. I want Arya here with me. We're the only ones left of our family, our true family. That should be our decision, not anyone else's. A hush fell. Baelish opened his mouth as if to speak, closed it, then adopted a gracious expression. As you wish, my lady. The Vale is your home now, as well as Lord Robin's. I live but to serve your safety. Arya met Baelish's gaze, a spark of challenge in her eyes. She could sense the tension thrumming in him, the subtle calculation behind his benign mask. He wouldn't let go of his prize so easily. But for the moment, with Royce's knights present and Sansa's open declaration, he had little choice but to concede. Lord Royce nodded, satisfied. Then we're agreed. Lady Arya will remain here, free and safe under the Vale's protection. Lord Baelish, I trust you'll allow her a place near her sister, Baelish inclined his head. Of course, we shall find appropriate chambers. Please stay as our guest, Lord Royce, to oversee the matter. Robin, dear boy, are you not pleased your cousin Sansa has found her sister? Robin blinked, rubbing his eyes. Yes, Sansa is nice. I'm tired. I want my milk of the poppy. Baelish patted the boy's arm. Yes, you'll have it soon. We mustn't overexert you. Arya felt a swirl of emotions. Triumph, relief, and a gnawing fear that Baelish still lurked in the shadows, plotting how to use this development to his advantage. For now, though, she turned to Sansa, who looked at her with tearful joy. Arya felt tears prick her own eyes. They were together. Somehow, despite all the death and betrayal, they had found each other. Behind them, the knights broke into quiet murmurs, and Baelish discreetly signaled a steward to prepare chambers. Lord Royce stood tall, exuding a sense of grim victory. Outside, the wind howled across the high peaks of the Vale, but in the high hall, two Stark sisters stood side by side once more, defying the storm that had scattered their house to the winds. Arya clasped Sansa's hand, glancing at Baelish's composed face. She thought of the Hound waiting below, the many miles they'd traveled, the blood they'd shed. A new chapter was opening, but she couldn't shake the feeling that greater dangers lay ahead. Still, for this moment at least, she had regained a piece of her family. The wolf and the lady, both battered by the world, reunited at the seat of the Falcon. Whatever came next, they would face it together.